The summer sun bore down on Redville with an oppressive weight, its heat wrapping around the town like a suffocating embrace that refused to let go. The air shimmered above the cracked asphalt, thick with humidity and the faint scent of dust, amplifying the restless quiet that hung over the streets. This was a place where time seemed to crawl, where every weathered building and sagging porch told tales of stagnation, and where the townsfolk whispered about those who left with a mix of resentment and envy. To them, abandoning Redville wasn't just a departure, it was an act of disloyalty, a betrayal etched into the collective memory of a community that clung fiercely to its past. Ethan Daniels stepped off the rickety bus, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement with a sound that felt almost foreign. In this faded corner of the world, his tailored blazer clung to his broad shoulders, its crisp lines a defiant contrast to the town's worn-out charm-splintered storefronts. The peeling paint, the sidewalks fractured by years of neglect. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, not the arrogance of someone who thought himself above others, but the steady assurance of a man who had weathered storms far fiercer than the judgmental stares now boring into him. His suitcase swung lightly in his grip as he started down Main Street, his dark eyes fixed ahead, though he couldn't ignore the ripple of murmurs that followed in his wake. Faces turned as he passed some familiar, etched with lines of recognition, others hardened by suspicion. Outside the diner, a handful of regulars leaned against the wall, their coffee cups paused mid-sip as they squinted at him. "Is that Ethan Daniels?" one muttered, voice low but sharp with disbelief. "Thought he'd never show his face here again. What's he doing back now?" The words weren't meant for him to hear, but they reached him all the same, brushing against his consciousness like a faint, persistent wind. His stride remained unbroken, though his fingers tightened briefly around the suitcase handle, a flicker of tension betraying the calm he wore like armor. Redville hadn't changed, its people still wielded their scrutiny like a blade, quick to cut down anyone who dared step beyond its boundaries. Years ago, he'd left with dreams too vast for its narrow streets, and now he returned as a stranger in a place that had once been home. Near the gas station, a cluster of young men lounged on the curb, their postures slouched and careless, their laughter slicing through the heavy air like a jagged edge. As Ethan approached, their eyes locked onto him, grins spreading wide with mocking glee. Well, look who it is," one of them drawled, a lanky figure with a sunburned face, leaning back on his elbows as if the world owed him its attention. "Ethan Daniels. Back from the big city. What's wrong, man? Couldn't hack it out there. Crawling back for some pity." The others snickered, feeding off the taunt like wolves circling a wounded prey. Ethan slowed, just for a heartbeat, his gaze settling on them steady, unflinching, but devoid of hostility. "Good to see you've all kept things exactly as they were," he replied, his voice smooth yet laced with a subtle sharpness that cut deeper than their jeers. The group fell silent, caught off guard by the weight of his words, the unspoken truth that their mockery reflected more on them than on him. The sunburned one muttered something under his breath, "Thinks he's too good for us now." But Ethan didn't turn back. He adjusted the lapel of his blazer with a small, deliberate motion, a gesture that spoke of resilience forged far beyond Redville's reach. Their barbs were familiar, almost comforting in their predictability, but they no longer held the power to wound him as they once had. Further along, the street grew busier, a thin crowd of townsfolk milling about, some offering curt nods, others casting sidelong glances heavy with unspoken questions. An older woman outside the grocer's stared openly, her lips pursed into a tight line of disapproval, her eyes narrowing as if trying to unravel the mystery of his return. Ethan tipped his head politely, his face a mask of composure, though inside he felt the faint stir of memory, her face, her judgment, a fixture of the Redville he'd left behind. Then a voice sliced through the hum of whispers. "Daniels." Ethan turned to see Frank Miller, the broad-shouldered owner of the general store, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Frank's tone dripped with condescension, loud enough to draw every nearby ear. "You sure picked a hell of a time to come back," he said, his smirk twisting the words into a challenge. "Town hasn't changed much, in case you were wondering. Guess you figured we'd all be rolling out the red carpet for you, huh?" Ethan stopped, meeting Frank's gaze with a calm that belied the storm brewing beneath. They'd known each other since boyhood. Frank, the self-anointed guardian of Redville's pride, had always despised those who dared to leave, as if their absence threatened his own rootedness. "Some things never do change," Ethan replied, his voice even but carrying an edge of steel. "But I didn't come back for the town, Frank. I came for what matters," Frank snorted. A dismissive sound meant to mask the flicker of unease Ethan's words stirred in him. But he had no retort. Ethan's quiet authority left the air charged, the onlookers shifting uncomfortably as he resumed his walk. Behind him, the whispers swelled, a chorus of curiosity and resentment, but he let them fade into the background. Redville's streets were a map of his past, every corner, every chipped curbstone whispering of the struggles he'd once faced, the small triumphs that had propelled him forward, the desperation that had driven him to leave. He wasn't here for nostalgia, though. The weight of his purpose pressed against his chest, heavier than the suitcase in his hand, grounding every step with resolve. A sudden clatter broke his focus. A rusted pickup truck lurched to a stop near the curb, its engine wheezing like a dying beast. From the driver's seat emerged Martha Callahan, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her weathered face creased with both exhaustion and determination. She was a fixture in Redville, a woman who'd spent decades tending to her orchard, her hands roughened by labor and her spirit unbowed by hardship. "Ethan Daniels, is that really you?" she called out, her voice ringing with a mix of astonishment and relief, cutting through the murmur of the growing crowd. "Bless your heart, I could use a hand here if you've got a minute." For the first time that day, Ethan's expression softened, a faint warmth breaking through his guarded demeanor. "Of course, Mrs. Callahan," he said, setting his suitcase down with care. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing forearms marked by years of effort, and approached the truck with the same steady purpose he'd carried all day. The vehicle was a relic, its paint chipped and its frame groaning under the weight of peach crates stacked haphazardly in the bed. Martha fanned herself with a rag, her breath uneven as she gestured toward the mess. "This old thing just gave out again always at the worst time," she said, frustration lacing her words. "Those peaches won't last long in this heat," Ethan nodded, already lifting the hood with a practiced ease. The engine radiated heat, its metal guts tangled and worn, but he leaned in without hesitation, his hands moving with quiet precision. "It's overheated," he said after a moment, his tone calm but certain. "Radiator's struggling." "Got any water?" Martha rummaged in the cab, producing a dented jug half filled with lukewarm water, her hands trembling slightly from the strain of the day. Ethan poured it in, adjusted a few hoses, and within minutes, the engine sputtered back to life, a low rumble that brought a spark of hope to Martha's tired eyes. "Bless you, Ethan," she exclaimed, her smile wide and genuine, softening the lines of her face. "You've saved me more times than I can count." "Not many would stop to help an old woman like me these days." Ethan brushed his hands clean, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "It's the least I can do," he said simply. "Let's get those peaches loaded right before they spill." He turned to the crates, lifting them with care, his movements unhurried but deliberate. Martha hesitated, her pride warring with her gratitude. "Oh, I couldn't ask you to," she began. But Ethan cut her off gently. "You didn't ask," he said, already securing the first crate. The moment was interrupted by a new voice, sharp and biting. Well, Frank Miller drawled, stepping out from his store across the street, his arms still crossed, his smirk now a full sneer. "Look at you, Ethan, playing the hero. What's next? A parade in your honor." The crowd shifted, their eyes darting between the two men, the tension thickening the air. Frank's voice rose, ensuring every ear caught his words. "Don't think a couple of good deeds wipe away the fact you turned your back on this place, Daniels. You left us behind, and now you waltz in like you still belong." Martha stiffened, her lips parting to defend Ethan, but he straightened before she could speak, turning to face Frank with a measured calm that silenced the murmurs around them. "Helping someone doesn't erase the past, Frank," Ethan said, his voice steady and resonant, carrying an authority that made the crowd lean in. "It's just what people do, or at least what they should. Even you could manage it if you tried." A few onlookers stifled laughs, the sound rippling through the tension like a stone dropped in still water. Frank's smirk faltered, his bravado cracking for a fleeting second before he scoffed and retreated to his store. the bell above the door jangling in his wake. Ethan returned to the crates, his focus unwavering. As if the exchange had been a mere ripple in his day, Martha watched him, her eyes brimming with a mix of gratitude and worry. "You didn't have to say a word to him," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. Ethan secured the last crate and met her gaze. "Some things need saying," he replied quietly, picking up his suitcase once more. As he walked on, the scene lingered in the air behind him, or eyes followed now, some curious, others narrowed with scrutiny. The whispers grew hushed but pointed, dissecting his every move. Ethan paid them no mind. He hadn't returned to Redville to win their favor or rewrite their opinions. His purpose ran deeper, a thread of justice woven into the fabric of his resolve, a reckoning with the consequences of power misused. Redville, with its unyielding judgment and petty cruelties, wouldn't make it easy for him, but then, nothing worth doing ever was. His steps echoed with purpose, unshaken by the weight of the town's gaze, each one a testament to the man he'd become and the lessons he carried. That true strength lay not in wielding power over others, but in standing firm against its abuse, no matter the cost. Ethan wiped the dust from his palms with slow, deliberate strokes, the grit scraping against his skin as he let out a long breath. He'd spoken his mind, his voice steady and measured, while I'd offered my own thoughts in return, the words hanging briefly between us like a quiet truce. "That's all there is to it," he said finally, his tone carrying the weight of a man who'd made peace with his choices. Nearby, Martha hoisted herself into the driver's seat of her weathered truck, the creak of the door punctuating the stillness. She leaned out the window, her graying hair catching the late afternoon light, and fixed Ethan with a look that brimmed with warmth. "You're a good man, Ethan," she said, her voice firm yet tender, as if she could will him to believe it. "Don't let this town twist you into thinking otherwise." Ethan dipped his head in a small, appreciative nod, the hard lines of his face softening for just a moment. "Drive safe, Mrs. Callahan," he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Those peaches are counting on you." The truck sputtered to life, its engine rumbling like distant thunder as it rolled away, leaving a faint cloud of dust in its wake. Ethan stood alone on the cracked sidewalk, his silhouette stark against the fading sun, while the townsfolk who'd lingered to watch the exchange drifted off one by one. But the air still crackled with an unspoken strain, a tension that clung to Redville like damp heat. Frank's earlier words had sliced deeper than Ethan cared to admit, striking a nerve he'd long thought buried. It wasn't the first time someone in this dusty little town had questioned why he'd come back, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Their stares followed him, some curious, some accusing, as he retrieved his suitcase from the ground, the leather handle cool against his palm. Yet their judgment, once a heavy yoke around his neck, now felt like a distant echo, powerless to sway him. With his chin lifted and his resolve unshaken, Ethan started down the street, his polished shoes clicking faintly against the uneven pavement. Behind him, the whispers of Redville buzzed like flies, soft but persistent, as the townsfolk watched his every step. Beneath those quiet stares, something darker was simmering, a pressure building in the cracks of this place that no one dared name aloud. Across town, the coal yard hummed with its own rhythm. The sharp clink of shovels biting into mounds of black rock cut through the thick, oppressive silence. Men in sweat-stained shirts and scuffed boots moved with the weary precision of years, spent under the sun's unrelenting glare. Beads of perspiration glistened on their brows, catching the light as they heaved sacks and swung tools, their breaths heavy in the stifling air. Ethan's arrival was a disruption, his crisp shirt and clean hands a stark contrast to the grime that coated everything here. His shoes crunched over the gravel as he passed, his posture tall and unshaken, a stranger in a world he'd once known intimately. The workers couldn't help but steal glances, their motions slowing as curiosity tugged at them. Who was this man, walking through their domain like he still belonged? Then came the voice, sharp, biting, laced with a disdain that seemed to coil in the air like smoke. "Well, if it ain't Ethan Daniels," Rick Barnes called out, stepping from the shadow of the coal office with a swagger that screamed authority. His aviator sunglasses flashed as he tilted his head, adjusting them with a flick of his wrist, his smirk cutting across his weathered face like a blade. "Didn't think Redville was still good enough for you," Ethan paused mid-step, turning slowly to face him, his expression as calm as a still pond. "Good afternoon, Officer Barnes," he replied, his voice even, unruffled. A quiet defiance woven into its steadiness, but Rick wasn't here for civility. He sauntered closer, his boots grinding the gravel beneath him, arms folding across his chest as he sized Ethan up. "What brings you back, Daniels? Tired of playing big shot out there in the fancy world?" His words dripped with mockery, each syllable a jab meant to provoke. The workers nearby faltered, their shovels hovering mid-swing as their eyes darted between the two men. Some leaned against their tools, their weathered faces guarded but alight with interest, while others exchanged quick, knowing glances. Ethan met Rick's gaze head-on, unflinching, his dark eyes steady as stone. "Just visiting," he said simply, the words carrying neither apology nor explanation. Rick barked a laugh, dragging the word out with exaggerated scorn. "Visiting, huh? That what you call it? Coming back here to rub our noses in what you left behind? Or maybe to preach about how much better life is out there?" Ethan's face remained a mask of composure, though a flicker of something wariness perhaps passed through his eyes. "I don't need to remind anyone of anything, Rick," he said coolly. "Seems you're handling that just fine on your own." A ripple of stifled amusement passed through the workers. One man bit back a grin, his dirt-streaked cheek twitching. Rick's jaw clenched, his pride bristling under the subtle jab. He hated being outmaneuvered, especially with an audience soaking in every word. "You know," he said, his voice dropping low, venom seeping into each syllable. "It's funny how people like you think you can waltz back in here and act like nothing's changed. Like we don't all remember how fast you turned tail and ran from this town." Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying Rick as if he were a puzzle not worth solving. "And what exactly did I run from, Rick?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with steel. "The judgment, the small-mindedness, or maybe it's something else eating at you?" The air grew heavy, Ethan's words settling like stones in a quiet stream. The workers froze, their breaths held, the weight of the moment pinning them in place. Rick's smirk flickered, a crack in his armor, but he squared his shoulders, refusing to yield. "You've got a sharp tongue, Daniels," he snapped, his voice rising. "Maybe you've forgotten what real work feels like. Out there, you probably sip coffee in some cushy office while others break their backs. But here, we get our hands dirty." He swept an arm toward the coal sacks piled high in the yard, their rough burlap stained black. "Maybe you need a little reminder of where you came from." Ethan's gaze flicked to the workers, then back to Rick, unflinching. "I haven't forgotten a thing, Rick," he said, his voice steady as granite. "But I don't need to prove myself to you." Rick's grin twisted into something darker, more dangerous. "Oh, I think you do," he shot back, stepping closer, his tone a challenge meant to echo across the yard. "You think you're above this town, above the folks who stayed and slogged it out while you chased your high-end mighty dreams. But to me, you're still just Ethan Daniels, the guy who bailed." Ethan took a single step forward, closing the gap, his posture unyielding, his voice low and firm like the rumble of an approaching storm. "And you're still the same man who thinks a badge gives him the right to lord over everyone else." The tension snapped taut, a live wire humming between them. The workers abandoned their tasks entirely, shovels and sacks forgotten, their eyes wide and locked on the standoff. No one spoke, but the air buzzed with their unspoken thoughts of admiring Ethan's quiet steel, others wary of Rick's simmering rage. Rick's face darkened, his hand twitching as he adjusted his sunglasses, grasping for control. "You do well to remember who's in charge here, Daniels," he growled, his voice quieter now but no less menacing. "This ain't your city, this is Redville, and we don't play by your rules." Ethan didn't blink. "Redville's rules haven't changed, have they?" he said, his words deliberate, cutting through the haze. "Still all about keeping people down, keeping them in line." Rick opened his mouth to fire back, but a crunch of gravel broke the moment. Tommy, a weary young worker with sweat-soaked hair plastered to his forehead, shifted uneasily, his shovel dangling in his grip. He didn't say a word, but his eyes flickered with conflict caught between Rick's iron grip and Ethan's unshakable calm. Rick's head whipped toward him, his glare a warning shot. Tommy flinched, dropping his gaze and lifting his shovel as if to retreat. But the brief defiance lingered in the air, and Ethan saw it. "Looks like you've got your crowd, Rick," Ethan said, his voice smooth but piercing. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Rick's smirk returned, though it was thinner now, less certain. "Just making sure you know your place," he said, gesturing toward the workers with a sweep of his arm, "and that they do too." Ethan's eyes swept over the yard, taking in the men their calloused hands, their guarded face before settling back on Rick. "I don't need reminders, Rick," he said, his voice low and resolute, "but maybe you do." The words hit like a quiet thunderclap, and for a moment Rick faltered, his bravado stripped bare. The onlookers held their breath, the silence stretching tight as a drum. Then Rick sneered, a last grasp at dominance, and turned sharply on his heel, stalking back toward the office without another word. Ethan remained where he stood, watching Rick's retreat, the weight of the encounter settling into his bones. The workers eased back into their tasks, their movements sluggish, their faces etched with quiet reflection. An older man, his brow slick with sweat, paused to wipe his face with a rag, catching Ethan's eye for a fleeting second. He gave a small, almost invisible note of flicker of respect, perhaps, or recognition before turning back to his shovel. The air hung heavy with the sharp, bitter scent of coal, a reminder of the town's unyielding grind. Moments later, Rick emerged from the office again, his stride brimming with forced confidence. Ethan hadn't moved, standing near the yard's edge, his calm unshaken by the lingering tension. Rick snatched a coal sack from the pile, his motions exaggerated as he hefted it slightly, the burlap straining under the jagged weight before he let it thud back to the ground. A plume of dust spiraled into the sweltering air. "Since you're so keen on proving folks wrong, Daniels," Rick called out, his voice loud enough to carry, "why don't you show us you're still one of us?" He shoved the sack toward Ethan with his boot, a smug grin splitting his face. "Let's see if you've still got it." The workers stilled again, their eyes bouncing between the two men like spectators at a slow-burning duel. Some murmured under their breath, their words lost in the heat, while others watched with blank, unreadable stares. Ethan didn't budge at first, his gaze locked on Rick's, weighing the challenge in the silence. Then, without a word, he stepped forward, bent down, and gripped the sack's rough edges. In one smooth, unhurried motion, he hoisted it onto his shoulder, the weight settling against him as if it were nothing. The yard fell quiet, the clinking of shovels replaced by the heavy stillness of awe. Rick's grin wavered, but he masked it quickly, leaning into his role as the agitator. "Well, look at that," he said, his tone thick with sarcasm. "Guess you didn't forget everything. Feeling right at home now, huh?" Ethan ignored him, his steps steady and deliberate as he carried the sack to the waiting truck. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, each stride a quiet rebuttal to Rick's taunts. He set the sack gently in the truck bed, dust swirling faintly as he turned back to face the group, his expression as calm and unyielding as ever. Rick wasn't done. He grabbed another sack, thrusting it toward Ethan with a rough shove. "Come on, Daniels. Don't quit now," he goaded. "This ain't some city desk job you don't get to stop after one go." Ethan stepped forward again, lifting the second sack with the same effortless grace, his silence a louder rebuke than any words could be. Rick's grin twisted, his voice sharpening. "What's wrong? No clever comeback this time? Or is this just too much for a guy who's used to letting others do the heavy lifting?" The workers shifted, unease rippling through them. Tommy, the young man from earlier, hesitated, his shovel dangling in his grip as he watched Ethan's quiet strength. Then, with a flicker of resolve, he stepped forward. "That's enough, Rick," he said, his voice soft but steady, barely cutting through the heat. Rick's head snapped toward him, his eyes narrowing like a predator sizing up prey. "You got something to say, kid," he barked, his tone a whipcrack. Tommy faltered, glancing at Ethan, who gave a subtle shake of his head, a silent plea to stand down. But Tommy pressed on, his voice firmer now. "He's not here to stir trouble, Rick. Let him be." Rick's gaze turned cold, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "You want to lose your job, Tommy? Keep talking, and that's exactly where this is headed." Tommy's fists clenched, his jaw tightening as frustration flared in his chest, but he stepped back. The fight draining from him under Rick's glare, Ethan watched the exchange, his heart heavy with the weight of it all cost of standing up, the price of staying silent. In Redville, justice was a fragile thing, easily crushed under the heel of power. And Rick, with his badge and his bluster, embodied the consequences of that power unchecked, a lesson Ethan knew too well, and one this town would never let him forget. The air at the yard was heavy with the scent of dust and sweat, a gritty haze hanging over the workers as they toiled under the relentless sun. Ethan stood there, shoulders squared, his body taut with an unspoken defiance that pulsed beneath his skin. His sharp eyes bore into Rick, the officer whose presence loomed like a storm cloud over the scene. The tension between them wasn't loud or explosive, it simmered quietly, a coiled spring waiting to snap. Ethan's gaze didn't waver, and though his lips remained still, the challenge in his stare spoke louder than any words could. Moments later, Ethan turned away, his boots crunching against the gravel as he retrieved the second sack. His muscles strained under the weight, but his movements were deliberate, almost graceful, as he hauled it back and set it down beside the first with a soft thud. Thus billowed up, catching the sunlight in faint, swirling clouds. As he straightened, his eyes flickered toward Tommy, a young worker hovering nearby. Their gazes locked for a fleeting second, and in that brief exchange, a quiet understanding passed between them, an unspoken pact forged in the heat of the moment. Tommy's face, weathered beyond his years by the yard's unforgiving labor, softened slightly, his brows lifting as if to say, "I see you." Ethan pivoted back to face Rick, his posture unwavering, exuding a calm that felt almost unnatural amidst the brewing storm. "Anything else, Officer Barnes?" he asked, his voice steady and even, slicing through the thick air like a blade. The question was simple, yet it carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone within earshot. It wasn't a taunt, nor a plea, it was a mirror held up to Rick, reflecting his authority back at him and daring him to look. Rick's jaw twitched, his mouth opening as if to fire back a retort, but the words caught in his throat. Ethan's composure rattled him more than any heated argument ever could. The officer's hands flexed at his sides, betraying the unease creeping up his spine. Finally, he managed to spit out a response. "You think this proves something?" His voice lacked its usual bite, the bravado he'd worn like armor earlier now fraying at the edges. "All it shows is you can still take orders like the rest of us." The words hung there, weak and unconvincing, as if Rick himself wasn't sure he believed them. Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow, measured step closer, his eyes never leaving Rick's. The space between them shrank, and the air grew denser, charged with the weight of their unspoken clash. "It shows I don't need to prove anything to you," Ethan said, his tone low and unshakable, each syllable deliberate. His calm wasn't just a shield, it was a weapon, stripping away Rick's bluster with surgical precision. Around them, the workers exchanged furtive glances, their hands pausing mid-task. The tension was palpable, a living thing that wrapped around the yard like a noose. One of the older men, his face creased with decades of labor and sun, cleared his throat, a rough, gravelly sound that cut through the silence like a saw. It wasn't much, but it was enough to jolt the moment, loosening the grip of the standoff. Rick, visibly flustered now, shifted his weight, his chest puffing out in a last-ditch effort to reclaim control. "Back to work, all of you," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. "Show's over." But the command fell flat. The workers didn't spring into motion as they usually did. Instead, they lingered, their eyes tracing Ethan's every move as he adjusted his blazer, a simple gesture that carried an air of quiet dignity, and strode toward the edge of the yard. His steps were steady, unhurried, each one a testament to the strength he carried within. His head remained high, not out of arrogance, but out of a deep-seated resolve that refused to bend. The silence he left in his wake was louder than any shout, a declaration that echoed across the dusty expanse. When he reached the road, he paused, turning slightly to cast a final glance back at the group. His eyes didn't hold pity or triumph, they shone with respect, a tribute to the workers' resilience, their shared struggle. That look alone stirred something in them. A few straightened their backs, their weary frames bolstered by the quiet honor he bestowed. Rick, meanwhile, stormed off toward the office, his boots kicking up small clouds of dirt with every furious step. His muttered curses floated back, too garbled to make out, but the frustration in them was unmistakable. The authority he'd clung to so tightly now felt like sand slipping through his fingers, fragile and fleeting. Tommy watched Ethan's figure recede down the street, his young face a battlefield of emotions, admiration warring with uncertainty. He'd tried to step in earlier, to diffuse the tension, but Rick had shut him down with a glare. Now, the exchange lingered in his mind, a seed planted deep, whispering questions about power and justice he wasn't yet ready to answer. By day's end, the yard buzzed with more than just the hum of labor. Whispers of the confrontation slithered through the workers, leaping from mouth to ear until someone pulled out a phone and hit record. The shaky footage, Ethan lifting sacks with quiet determination, Rick's taunts ringing hollow, spread like wildfire. By sunset, it had escaped the yard's confines, racing across Redville's digital veins and igniting a storm online. Debates flared, dividing the town like a fault line, cracking through its heart. The next morning, as the sun crept over Redville's rooftops, the yard incident was all anyone could talk about. At the local diner, where the coffee flowed as freely as the gossip, the air crackled with tension. Townsfolk huddled around tables, their phones glowing with the now infamous video. Some watched in silence, others argued in sharp bursts, their voices overlapping like clashing waves. George Harper, a grizzled man who'd lived in Redville since birth, leaned back in his chair, a smirk tugging at his lips. "This is ridiculous," he grumbled, slamming his coffee cup down hard enough to make the spoon rattle. Rick was just messing around. "What's the big deal?" Across from him, Linda Collins bristled, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. "Humiliating someone isn't a joke, George," she shot back, her voice cutting through the diner's hum. He shoved those sacks at Ethan like he was trying to prove he's still the big man around here. Her eyes flashed with indignation, her fingers tapping restlessly against her arm as she spoke. George scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, come on. Daniels walked out on this town years ago. Maybe he needed a reminder he's not above us." His tone was stubborn, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes, buried beneath layers of pride. "Better," Linda's voice rose, sharp and unyielding. "You think standing there, taking that kind of mockery, makes you better?" Ethan didn't say a word, George. He did the work and walked away with his head up. "Can you say Rick did the same?" Her words landed like stones, and a ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Heads turned, eyes darting between the two. George shifted in his seat, discomfort creeping into his posture, but he doubled down. "Look," he said, jabbing a finger at his phone where the video was frozen mid-scene. Ethan's calm figure, stark against Rick's agitation. "This is just people making a mountain out of a molehill." Rick didn't mean anything by it. "He sure looked like he did," came a quieter voice from near the counter. Tommy stepped forward, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. He wasn't joking, George. He was trying to put Ethan in his place. His words were soft but firm, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen it all unfold up close. George's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're just a kid, Tommy. You don't know how things work around here. Rick's been keeping this town safe for years. Don't act like you've got any say in this." His tone was harsh, meant to cut. But Tommy didn't flinch. He just stood there, his gaze steady, a flicker of defiance sparking in his eyes. Before the argument could escalate, Betty, the diner's no-nonsense owner, swept in, her apron stained with coffee and grease. "That's enough," she snapped, her voice a whip crack that silenced the room. "If you're gonna bicker, take it outside. Some of us are trying to eat in peace." The tension didn't dissolve, it simmered, retreating into hushed whispers as forks clinked against plates. But the divide remained, etched deeper with every replay of that video. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, Ethan sat at the worn kitchen table of his childhood home. The house was modest, its walls steeped in memories, of his father's booming laugh bouncing through the halls, of his mother's stern voice guiding him through life's lessons. Grace Daniels sat across from him now, her sharp eyes tracing his face as he recounted the day's events. Her hands rested on the table, steady and weathered, a silent anchor amidst the storm of his words. When he finished, she leaned back, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she spoke, her voice firm yet laced with a quiet ache. "You didn't deserve that, Ethan." "No one does." Ethan shrugged, though his jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration breaking through his calm. "It's not about what I deserve, Mom. It's about what this town is." His eyes drifted to the window, where the fading light cast long shadows across the yard. Grace's lips pressed into a thin line, a hint of bitterness threading through her words. "This town hasn't changed much, has it? They cling to their grudges like they're all they've got left." She paused, studying him. "You've seen that now." He didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered outside, lost in the swirl of his thoughts. "It's not the same town I left," he said finally, his voice low, "and maybe it never will be. But that doesn't mean I can't try to shake it up a little." Grace raised an eyebrow, curiosity mingling with concern. "And how do you plan to do that?" Ethan turned back to her, his eyes steady and resolute. "By showing them what respect looks like. By making them face what they've turned into." There was no grandiosity in his tone, just a quiet, unshakable determination. A faint smile tugged at Grace's lips, though her eyes softened with worry. "You've always been stubborn. That's your father in you." She reached out, her hand brushing his briefly. He chuckled, a small, fleeting sound, but the weight of their exchange lingered. He covered her hand with his own, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm not letting this go, Mom. Not this time." Grace's grip tightened, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just don't let this town take more from you than it already has, Ethan. It doesn't deserve that." By evening, the video had outgrown Redville, spilling into neighboring towns and catching the eye of local news outlets. Online, hashtags like Yard Justice and Respect Matters trended, fueling debates that mirrored the diners' divide. Comments flooded in "Rick Barnes is a disgrace. No one should be treated like that in front of a crowd. Small towns can't stand seeing anyone risothy drag them back down every time. Ethan Daniels thinks he's too good for Redville." Rick was just keeping him grounded. The town buzzed with a restless energy. The yard incident now a lightning rod for deeper-wound pride, prejudice, and the hunger for respect in a place that resisted change like a rusted hinge. Ethan watched it all unfold from the sidelines, his silence a stark contrast to the chaos. But inside, something was shifting. The time for standing back was over. As Redville fractured further, he made his choice. He wouldn't let the town's old ways define the story. The next move was his, and he'd ensure it carried the weight of his voice. The following day, the yard's usual rhythm faltered as a low rumble cut through the air. Workers glanced up, their faces etched with curiosity and suspicion, as a sleek black car rolled into the lot. Its polished surface gleamed under the midday sun, a stark intruder in Redville's rough-edged world. The tinted windows hid its driver, adding a layer of mystery that felt alien to the town's gritty familiarity. When the door swung open, Ethan stepped out, his blazer catching the light as he adjusted his cuffs with a calm precision. Whispers erupted instantly, racing through the workers like a gust of wind. "What's he doing here in that? He doesn't look like he belongs anymore. Who even drives a car like that around here?" Ethan's gaze swept the yard, steady and unflinching, silencing the murmurs as he strode toward its center. His presence alone commanded the space, a quiet force that didn't need to shout. From the office, Rick emerged, sunglasses low on his nose, his usual swagger faltering as he took in the sight. For a moment, he froze, caught off guard by the man before him, Ethan, unyielding, a living rebuke to the power Rick had abused. Justice, Ethan knew, wasn't loud or vengeful. It was this, standing tall, exposing the fragility of those who wielded authority without care. And in that moment, as the yard held its breath, the lesson began to take root. Power unchecked would always crumble under the weight of its own consequences. The sun beat down relentlessly on the dusty yard, its heat shimmering off the cracked earth as the faint hum of machinery rumbled in the distance. Rick's voice sliced through the stillness, sharp and brassy, carrying over the heads of the scattered workers like a whip cracking in the air. "Trading coal dust for a chauffeur, huh? What's this, Daniel Sanother, one of your big, showy entrances?" His words dripped with mockery, loud enough to ensure no one missed them. His chest puffed out as if he owned the very ground they stood on. The workers froze mid-motion, their hands hovering over tools, eyes flicking nervously between the two men. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken tension that seemed to coil tighter with every breath. Ethan stood unfazed, his posture steady as a rock against the tide of Rick's taunts. He didn't flinch, didn't let his gaze waver. Instead, he turned away from Rick's bluster, his attention settling on a cluster of workers nearby. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, sweat streaking through the grime on their cheeks, and their clothes hung loose from long hours under the sun. Ethan offered them a simple nod, a quiet gesture that carried more weight than words. "Afternoon," he said, his voice smooth and even, like a cool stream cutting through the oppressive heat. The men hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They darted quick glances toward Rick, then back to Ethan, as if caught between two opposing storms and unsure which way to turn. Inside, they wrestled with the moment's hold. They nod back, risk Rick's wrath, or stay silent and safe. Rick, sensing his grip on the scene slipping, refused to let the silence linger. His boots crunched against the gravel as he strode forward, planting himself squarely in Ethan's path. His eyes narrowed, a glint of defiance sparking in them. "What's your game, Daniels?" he demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You waltz back here to rub it in our faces how much better your life's gotten. We've all seen that video. You know hauling those sacks didn't make you look so grand, did it?" A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of curiosity and unease. But Ethan's face remained a mask of calm. He didn't blink, didn't let Rick's barb dig beneath his skin. Instead, he met Rick's glare head-on, his own eyes steady and unyielding. "I'm not here to dredge up the past, Rick," he said, his voice low but firm, each word deliberate. "I came to talk to the people who actually matter." The subtle sting of his words landed like a quiet thunderclap, and Rick's jaw clenched, his bravado faltering for a split second. Before Rick could fire back, Ethan turned to the workers again, stepping closer to them. The yard stretched out around him, a sprawling patchwork of dirt and machinery, the air thick with the scent of oil and sweat. "I know what it's like to stand where you are," he said, his voice rising to carry across the open space. "I've felt the weight of those long days, the ache in your bones. The way people look down on you and tell you what you do doesn't count. But I'm here to say it does. Every one of you matters, every single one." His words hung in the air, raw and real, stirring something deep in the workers' chests. They exchanged hesitant looks, their skepticism cracking like dry earth under rain. For some, it was the first time in years anyone had spoken to them with such conviction, and it planted a seed of something unfamiliar up, maybe, or the faint glimmer of dignity they'd long buried. Rick, unwilling to let Ethan's words take root, let out a harsh, barking laugh that shattered the quiet. "Oh, that's Rich Daniels," he sneered, crossing his arms tight across his chest, a real heartwarming speech straight out of some fairy tale. "But don't kid yourself. These people don't need you swooping in here like some caped hero. You're just scrambling to polish up your image after that mess you made." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the cracks in his confidence, but he pressed on, desperate to claw back control. Ethan turned slowly, his gaze locking onto Rick's with an intensity that made the other man falter. "You think this is about saving face?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with steel. "This is about respect, something you wouldn't recognize if it hit you square in the chest." Rick's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides as the words sank in. He opened his mouth to snap back, but before he could, a gravelly voice cut through the standoff. "Respect's been hard to come by around here," said Jim Hayes, an older worker with a weathered face and hands roughened by decades of labor. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing the dirt, his eyes fixed on Rick with a quiet, unyielding strength. Jim was a man who'd seen it all: long shifts, broken promises, and bosses who thought fear was the same as loyalty. "He's not wrong, Rick," Jim continued, his voice steady despite the tremor of age. "We've all watched how you treat people like we're nothing more than tools to toss aside. When you're done," the crowd stirred, a few heads nodding in silent agreement, their faces reflecting years of bottled-up frustration. Rick's glare snapped to Jim, his voice rising with a sharp edge. "Watch yourself, Jim. Don't forget who keeps your paycheck coming." The threat hung heavy, but it only fueled the fire in Ethan's eyes. He raised a hand, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. "Threatening people doesn't make you strong, Rick. It makes you weak." The words landed hard, and for the first time, Rick looked truly rattled. His eyes darted to the workers, their silence a deafening rebuke, louder than any shout could have been. Just then, the low growl of an engine broke the tension. A sleek black SUV rolled into the lot, its government plates gleaming in the sunlight. The workers' whispers started up again, a mix of confusion and curiosity swirling through the crowd. "Who's that?" one muttered. "What's going on?" another asked, craning his neck. A woman stepped out, her sharp suit pristine against the dusty backdrop, a clipboard clutched in her hand. She moved with the quiet authority of someone used to being heard, her heels clicking against the ground as she approached Ethan. Rick's bravado crumbled further, his sunglasses slipping down his nose as he watched her. "Governor Daniels," she said, her voice crisp and professional as she extended a hand. "We're ready for your briefing." The yard fell into stunned silence. Every pair of eyes swung to Ethan, who shook her hand with the same unshakable calm he'd carried all along. Rick's mouth moved, but only a faint "governor" escaped, barely a whisper, his earlier swagger evaporating like mist in the sun. Ethan turned to the crowd, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Yes, I'm the governor of this state. I came here because places like Redville deserve better, because you deserve better. You deserve respect, support, and a future that doesn't forget you." The revelation hit like a shockwave. Some workers stared at him with wide-eyed awe, their minds racing to reconcile the man before them with the title he bore. Others exchanged stunned glances, whispering among themselves. Rick, meanwhile, stood frozen, his face pale, his earlier confidence a distant memory. Jim broke the silence, his voice thick with disbelief. "Governor Daniels? Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Ethan offered a faint, almost wistful smile. "Because titles don't matter, Jim. Actions do." The workers nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in, stirring something deep within them, a quiet resolve, a flicker of pride they hadn't felt in years. Rick, scrambling to salvage his dignity, stepped forward, his voice shaky. "Now, hold on back there. That was just a joke, you know. No harm meant." Ethan's gaze sharpened, cutting through Rick's flimsy excuse. "A joke," he repeated, his tone icy. "Tell me, Rick, did it look like anyone was laughing?" Rick faltered, his words dying in his throat as Ethan turned back to the workers. "You've been told you're less than you are, that respect and dignity aren't yours to claim. But that stops now. You deserve better from this town, from your leaders, and from yourselves." The crowd began to thin as workers drifted away, some murmuring agreement, others lost in thought. Ethan stepped aside with his aide, already mapping out plans for a community meeting. The air buzzed with a new energy, a tentative hope taking root in the dust of Redville. Later that evening, the town hall was a sea of bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, the wooden walls groaning under the weight of the packed crowd. The air was thick with anticipation, the faint scent of old timber mingling with the nervous sweat of the townsfolk. Faces reflected a kaleidoscope of emotions: curiosity, doubt. Defiancia's whispers darted through the room like restless insects. When Ethan Daniels stepped onto the small stage, the noise hushed instantly. He didn't need to demand attention. His presence alone pulled every eye to him. Standing behind the podium, he paused, letting the silence stretch until it felt almost tangible. "Redville," he began, his voice steady but resonant, filling the room like a heartbeat. "This town was built on sweat and grit. It's the place that forged me, taught me how to stand tall when the world tries to knock you down. It gave me the strength to keep going." A few murmurs crept back in, but Ethan raised his hands slightly, a subtle gesture that silenced them without effort. "But Redville taught me something else, too," he went on, his tone darkening. "It showed me how fear and judgment can take root, how fast we turn on each other instead of building each other up. What happened yesterday at the yard wasn't just a petty jab, it was a mirror held up to this town. And we all saw the cracks." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Some avoided his gaze, staring at their boots, while others glared back with stubborn defiance. Ethan leaned forward, his hands gripping the podium's edges, his voice gaining an edge of quiet fire. "That wasn't just a joke. It wasn't harmless. It was humiliation, raw and deliberate. Not just for me, but for everyone here who's ever been made to feel small, who's ever been told their worth stops at the edge of someone else's power. From the corner, a sharp breath cut the air. George Harper, a burly man with a face carved from years of hard living, shot up from his chair. His cheeks flushed red, his voice booming with indignation. "Now, wait just a damn minute. You don't get to stroll back here after all these years and preach about what's wrong with us. You left, Danielle Shue turned your back on Redville. What gives you the right to stand there and judge us?" The room stirred, tension coiling tighter as every head swiveled to Ethan. But he didn't flinch, didn't waver. "You're right, George," he said, his voice firm yet measured, meeting the older man's fury head-on. "I did leave, and it tore me up to do it. But you know why? Because this town made it clear that if I didn't fit its tight little box, I didn't belong. I didn't leave because I wanted Toy left because I had to." George scoffed, crossing his arms tight across his chest. "Oh, spare me. Redville's not some paradise, sure, but it's honest. We keep people grounded. You didn't like that. Fine, but don't act like we need fixing because of it." His words carried the weight of a man who'd spent his life defending the only world he knew. Even as it crumbled around him, Ethan stepped out from behind the podium, his movements slow and deliberate, closing the distance between them. "Grounded," he echoed, his voice low but piercing. "Is that what you call it, George? Because what I see is a town that mistakes small-mindedness for tradition, a place where respect's only yours if you shrink down enough to fit someone else's mold." The room fell deathly still, George's defiance flickering as he sank back into his seat, his face a storm of anger and doubt. Ethan returned to the podium, his voice rising to fill the space. "Respect isn't something you bully out of people. It's not a weapon you wield with threats or cruelty. It's what we owe each other because we know its worth. And until Redville figures that out, it'll stay stuck trapped by the very chains it's forged." A few hesitant claps broke out, swelling into a scattered wave of applause. Not everyone was swayed. Rick lingered at the back, his arms crossed, his eyes burning with resentment. The room had shifted. The lesson was clear. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about recognizing the cost of power misused, and the strength it took to rebuild what had been broken. In the dimly lit room, the air hung heavy with unspoken tension, thick enough to choke on. Barnes squirmed in his seat, his broad shoulders hunched forward as if trying to shrink into himself. The cocky swagger that usually defined him strut of a man who owned every inch of ground he walked on had vanished, replaced by a restless unease that flickered in his darting eyes, and the way his fingers drummed nervously against the armrest. He looked like a man caught in a trap he hadn't seen coming, and the realization gnawed at him, souring the bravado he'd worn like a second skin for years. Across the room, Rick lurched to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the worn wooden floor. His lips moved in a low, agitated mutter, half-formed words tumbling out under his breath, too quiet for anyone to catch, but loud enough to signal his intent to flee. He took a few hurried steps toward the door, his boots thudding against the planks, his mind clearly racing for an escape from the weight pressing down on him. But before he could vanish into the cool night beyond the threshold, a voice sliced through the haze of the room like a blade honed to perfection. "Officer Barnes," Ethan called out, his tone steady yet laced with an authority that demanded attention. It wasn't loud, wasn't shrill, just calm, unshakable, the kind of voice that could quiet a storm. "Leaving so soon?" The question hung there, simple but piercing, and every head in the room swiveled toward Rick. His momentum faltered mid-step, his body stiffening as if an invisible hand had grabbed him by the collar. For a moment, he stood frozen, his back to the crowd, his breath shallow and ragged. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he turned around. His face was a mask of chalky pallor, his jaw locked tight, as though he were biting back 1,000 retorts he didn't dare unleash. "I don't see the point in sticking around," Rick snapped, his voice sharp with defiance, though it trembled at the edges. He shoved his hands into his pockets, then yanked them out again, unable to settle. "You've already decided what you think of me, haven't you?" His eyes flicked accusingly toward Ethan, searching for a crack in the man's composure, some sign of weakness to exploit. But Ethan stood there, unshaken, his gaze locked on Rick like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. "This isn't about you, Rick," Ethan replied, his words measured but heavy with meaning. It's about what you stand for, what you've chosen to do with the power you were given. You didn't use it to shield anyone or lift them up. You used it to grind someone down, to puff yourself up at their expense. His voice didn't rise, but it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller, the air tighter. Rick's fists balled at his sides, his knuckles whitening as his temper flared. You think you're above me? Rick shot back, his voice climbing now, cracking with raw emotion. Just because you've got some shiny title and a fancy car parked out front? You don't know a damn thing about what it takes to keep this town running. He jabbed a finger toward Ethan, his chest heaving, as if the accusation could somehow shield him from the truth staring him down. Ethan took a single step closer, closing the gap between them with deliberate calm. Running a town takes leadership, Rick, he said, his tone as steady as ever, though it carried an edge of steel. Real leadership builds people up, it doesn't tear them apart. It gives strength, not shame. What you did, that wasn't leading. That was failing. His words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper into the silence that followed. The crowd held its breath, the tension sparking through the room like a live wire ready to ignite. Rick's bravado wavered, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He stood there, exposed, grappling with the weight of Ethan's judgmental weight he couldn't shrug off no matter how hard he tried. Ethan turned away from him, facing the sea of wide-eyed townsfolk who watched in rapt silence. This isn't just about one moment or one man, he said, his voice rising now, resolute and clear. It's about how we choose to live with each other every single day. We can make Redville better not by clutching to the old ways that divide us, but by choosing respect, by standing together. His eyes swept the room, meeting theirs with a quiet plea for something more. This time, when the applause erupted, it wasn't timid or scattered. It swelled, strong and unified. A chorus of hands clapping and feet stomping as people rose from their seats. Their faces glowed with a mix of awe and introspection, as if Ethan's words had lit a spark they hadn't known was there. Rick, defeated, sank back into his chair, his head bowed, avoiding the eyes that no longer looked at him with the deference he'd once demanded. Something fundamental had shifted in Redville that night, a crack in the foundation of how things had always been. As the clapping faded and people trickled out into the night, Ethan's words lingered in the air, a fragile hope trembling on the edge of change. But whether that hope would take root or wither away remained a question only time could answer. The next morning, Redville woke to a tension as thick as the fog rolling in from the hills. Word had spread like wildfire. Ethan Daniels had called an emergency gathering in the town square. A bold move to confront the incident that had rattled the community to its core. Townsfolk streamed into the open space, their boots crunching on the gravel, their faces etched with curiosity, apprehension, and a flicker of something like anticipation. The square buzzed with low murmurs, the kind of restless hum that comes before a storm breaks. At the heart of the crowd stood Rick Barnes, his usual air of untouchable confidence replaced by a grimace that pulled his mouth into a tight, bitter line. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, his eyes scanning the faces around him for allies he wasn't sure he'd find. Ethan stepped forward, his posture tall and unyielding, his gaze locking onto Rick with the intensity of a man who'd made up his mind long ago. "Officer Barnes," he began, his voice ringing out across the square, firm and unwavering. "It's time we talk about what happened." The words were simple, but they carried a force that made Rick's whole body tense, his jaw clenching so hard the muscles twitched under his skin. Rick squared his shoulders, trying to muster some shred of his old defiance. "I already told you." "Daniels," he said, his voice rough with frustration, "this whole thing's been blown out of proportion. It was a joke. People need to lighten up and stop making a mountain out of a molehill." He forced a laugh, but it came out hollow, dying in the air as the crowd's murmurs grew sharper. Ethan's face remained a mask of calm, but his eyes burned with something fiercer. He gestured toward the gathered townsfolk, his hands sweeping out in a slow, deliberate arc. "A joke?" he asked, his voice cutting through Rick's bluster like a knife through cloth. "Was it a joke to them? Because what I see are people who've spent years swallowing the kind of treatment you brush off as nothing. You don't get to wave this away, Rick." Not this time. His words were quiet but razor-sharp, and they struck home. The crowd stirred, a ripple of agreement swelling as heads nodded and voices rose in quiet support. Rick's discomfort deepened, his eyes darting to the familiar faces around him, people he'd known his whole life, people he'd always assumed would back him no matter what. "Look," he said, his tone fraying with desperation, "I've been here my whole damn life. I've poured more into Redville than most of these folks ever will. You really think one stupid slip-up wipes all that out?" His voice cracked, and he hated himself for it, hated the way it betrayed the fear clawing at his chest. Ethan took another step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel, his presence steady as a rock in a river. "This isn't about wiping out your past, Rick," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's about owning what you've done. If you really care about this town, you'll do what's right. Apologies not just to me, but to everyone you've stepped on along the way." His words hung there, a challenge wrapped in a lifeline, and Rick felt the ground shift beneath him. For a moment, it looked like he might both. His body tensed, his eyes flicking toward the edge of the square. But the crowd's growing restlessness pinned him in place, their murmurs swelling into a low roar. From the sidelines, a young voice broke through the din. Tommy, the lanky co-worker who'd tried to stand up for Ethan back at the yard, stepped forward, his hands trembling but his gaze steady. "He's right, Rick," Tommy said, his voice clear despite the nerves dancing in his chest. "You've been throwing your weight around for years, and we've all seen it. This isn't just about Ethan, it's about all of us." The crowd surged with newfound courage, emboldened by Tommy's stand. "Yeah, it's about time someone called it out," a woman shouted from the back. "We're tired of putting up with it," another voice chimed in, rough and resolute. Rick's head whipped toward Tommy, his face flushing red with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid," he snarled, his voice rising. "You think keeping this town together is easy? You wouldn't last a day in my shoes." Tommy didn't flinch. He squared his narrow shoulders, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "Maybe I wouldn't," he admitted, "but I know what it's like to feel small, to be treated like I don't matter, and I know that's wrong. You've been hiding behind that badge, using it to shove people down, and it's got to stop." His words rang out, raw and honest, and the crowd's murmurs grew louder, a tide of agreement washing over the square. Rick's bluster began to crumble, his eyes darting around as he realized the support he'd always counted on was slipping away like sand through his fingers. Ethan seized the moment, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "This isn't about breaking you, Rick," he said, his tone firm but laced with a quiet hope. "It's about building something better. But that starts with you owning up to your mistakes. Apologize. Show this town you're willing to give respect, not just take it." The weight of the crowd's scrutiny bore down on Rick, his defenses cracking like dry earth under a heavy rain. He stood there, silent, his gaze dropping to the gravel at his feet. The square held its breath, the air taut with anticipation. Finally, he let out a long, shaky exhale and lifted his head. "I was wrong," he said, the words stumbling out, foreign and clumsy on his tongue. He turned to face the crowd, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "What I did at the yard, it wasn't right. It wasn't fair to Ethan, or to any of you." His voice steadied, though the strain was still there, etched into every syllable. "I've let this badge get to my head more times than I'd like to admit. If I've disrespected anyone here, I'm sorry." A hush fell over the square, the silence thick and heavy. Then a tentative clap broke through, followed by another, until the applause built into a steady rhythm, not thunderous, but real. Tommy gave a small nod, a faint smile tugging at his lips, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. Ethan's stern expression softened, and he stepped forward, placing a hand on Rick's shoulder. "Admitting you're wrong isn't easy," he said, his voice warm with a trace of respect. "But it's the first step toward something better. Now it's up to you to prove it with more than words." Rick nodded, his jaw tight, but there was a shift in his eyes, a flicker of relief, maybe, or the barest hint of humility breaking through the cracks. The crowd began to thin out, their voices rising in quiet conversation as they drifted away. For the first time in years, Redville felt alive with possibility, the air humming with the faint promise of change. As Rick walked off, his head low but his stride steady. He knew deep down that reclaiming the respect he'd squandered would take more than a single apology. It would take a lifetime of effort. For Ethan, the moment was a pivot. Not just for Rick, but for the entire town, a chance to rewrite the rules they'd all lived by. For too long, in the days that followed, Redville shed its sleepy stillness like a snake sloughing off old skin. The town, so long locked in its predictable rhythms, buzzed with a restless energy. Debates spilled out from quiet corners over diner tables sticky with syrup, across church pews still warm from Sunday service, into the open streets where voices clashed without apology. In the heart of the main square, a small but fierce group gathered, their handmade signs thrust high above their heads. The messages scrawled in bold marker read like battle cries: respect is earned, not demanded, and leadership without accountability is tyranny. It was a sight Redville had never witnessed: ordinary folks stepping out of the shadows to challenge the authority they'd once accepted without question. Among them stood Linda Collins, a weary woman with gray-streaked hair and a fire in her eyes that hadn't dimmed with age. Ethan's words at the town hall had struck her like a match to dry tinder, igniting a resolve she'd buried under years of keeping her head down. Now, with a bullhorn clutched in her steady hands, she faced the growing crowd, her voice cutting through the morning chill. "This isn't just about Rick Barnes," she declared, her tone sharp and unyielding. "This is about every single time we've let disrespect and fear run this town. It's about standing up for ourselves, for each other, for what's right." Her words rang out, fierce and clear, and the crowd answered with cheers. A few more souls drifting over to join the fray. Some hesitated, their steps faltering as old habits tugged at them. But the group's swelling energy pulled them in, bolstering their courage. The protest wasn't a tidal wave. It didn't swallow the town whole, but its ripples spread, stirring something deep in Redville's bones. Linda's voice carried a truth too long ignored. Justice wasn't just a word, but a living thing that demanded action. Rick's fall from grace had laid bare a hard lesson: power, when wielded without care, corroded not just its victims but the one who held it. The crowd's signs and shouts were a testament to that, a warning etched in ink and sweat that the old ways wouldn't hold forever. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the square, the air thrummed with a quiet defiance, a promise that Redville might finally learn to demand better, not just from its leaders, but from itself. In the heart of Redville, a town once cloaked in the heavy stillness of tradition, a subtle yet undeniable shift was stirring. The air felt charged, as if the very streets were whispering secrets of transformation. Inside the dinero weathered relic of better days, the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation painted a scene of restless normalcy. Yet, beyond the steamed-up windows, a small cluster of older townsfolk stood with furrowed brows, their eyes narrowing at the changes unfolding before them. George Harper, a grizzled man with hands hardened by decades of labor, leaned against the glass, his voice low and bitter. "This town's losing its spine," he grumbled, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge the thought. "All this fuss over some petty coal yard nonsense. Back in my time, you handled your problems, dusted yourself off, and kept moving. None of this whining." His words hung heavy, laced with a nostalgia that felt more like a shield than a memory. Inside, Betty, the diner's owner, slammed a dented coffee pot onto the counter with a force that made the mugs rattle. Her face was a storm of frustration, her graying curls trembling as she spun to face George. "Back in your day," she snapped, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Back in your day, folks didn't have the guts to open their mouths when something was wrong. They just swallowed it down and let it fester. Maybe that's why we're in this mess. Too many people too scared to fight for what's right." Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening as she stared him down, daring him to argue. The tension in the room thickened, a mirror to the larger storm brewing across Redville, a town teetering on the edge of its own reckoning, forced to decide whether to cling to the rusted chains of yesterday or step boldly into an uncertain tomorrow. Out of the spotlight, Ethan Daniels watched it all unfold from the shadows. He was a quiet figure, unassuming yet magnetic. His presence felt more in the ripples he caused than in any grand gestures. Over the past few days, he'd been weaving through Redville's tight-knit corners, sitting with small groups of residents in dimly lit living rooms and dusty backyards. He listened as they poured out their fears, their hopes, their quiet rage at a system that had long ignored them. One such gathering took place in the cramped home of Jim Hayes, a coal worker whose voice had trembled but held firm when he dared to speak out at the town hall. The room was a patchwork of worn furniture and flickering lamplight, filled with a handful of workers whose faces flickered between cautious optimism and gnawing doubt. Jim sat forward in his sagging armchair, his callous fingers twisting together as he met Ethan's steady gaze. "I never thought I'd live to see Redville stand up to a man like Rick," he admitted, his voice rough with disbelief. "But now that it's happening, I can't shake this feeling. What if it all backfires? What if we're just stirring up trouble that'll bury us deeper?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the storm of uncertainty swirling in Jim's eyes. "Change isn't a straight path, Jim," he said, his tone steady yet warm, like a fire that comforts even as it burns. "It's rough, it's messy, and half the time it feels like you're clawing your way up a mountain with no peak in sight. But that's how you know it's real, because it's hard. And the best part, you're not climbing alone." His words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the room. Tommy, a younger worker with a spark of defiance in his eyes, jumped in, his voice cutting through the quiet. "It's bigger than Rick now," he said, his hands gesturing wildly as if trying to grasp the enormity of it all. "People are waking up. They're starting to see we don't have to live like this, like we're nothing. We deserve more." Jim's frown softened, his doubts wavering as he nodded slowly, the weight of possibility settling into his bones. "You think it'll last, though?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Folks around Herethi slide back into old ways like it's second nature." Ethan's gaze didn't falter. "That's up to us," he said firmly, his words carrying the weight of a vow. "No one's going to swoop in and save Redville for us. If we want this town to be different or be better, we've got to roll up our sleeves and make it happen ourselves." The room fell silent, the air thick with the gravity of his challenge. One by one, the workers nodded, their resolve hardening like steel in a forge. Outside, beyond the peeling paint of Jim's front porch, the coal yard loomed a hulking symbol of Redville's past. There, tensions simmered as a knot of Rick's loyalists gathered near the entrance, their faces carved with defiance. Joe Carter, a stocky man with a perpetual scowl, kicked at the gravel with his boot. "This is spiraling out of control," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "All this talk about respect and dignity, it's just noise. Rick's poured more into this town than any of these complainers ever will, and now they're ready to string him up over one slip-up." Beside him, Frank Miller crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "It's not just Rick they're after," he growled. "They're acting like Redville's some broken mess, like we're the ones who've messed it up. That's what burns me." But even as they grumbled, the tide was shifting. Across the town, voices once silenced were growing louder, protests erupting in the streets, hushed conversations spilling into the open, a quiet revolution taking root. Redville was waking up, confronting the ghosts of its past with a courage it hadn't known it possessed. And the change wasn't confined to its borders. A shaky video of Ethan's stand at the coal yard, paired with snippets from the town hall, had ignited a firestorm online. It spread like wildfire, drawing eyes far beyond Redville's dusty roads. Local news stations seized the story, painting the town as a battleground for a larger war, respect versus power, community versus complacency. Morning talk shows buzzed with pundits, some hailing Ethan as a beacon of righteousness, others scoffing at the uproar as a tempest in a teacup. Yet Ethan brushed off the spotlight, turning down every interview that came his way. "This isn't about me," he told Linda Collins one afternoon, their voices echoing softly in the community center's empty halls. Linda, a weary woman with a fire in her eyes, nodded fiercely. "You've given us the push we needed, Ethan," she said, her determination palpable. "Now it's on us to keep the momentum alive." As dusk settled over Redville one evening, the clamor of the day softened into a gentle hum. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across streets that bore the scars of neglect. But beneath the fading light, something lingered, a pulse of change, fragile yet fierce. The town was no longer content to sit idly by. trapped in the comfort of what had always been. Conversations once stifled by fear now flowed freely, and the walls that had kept people silent for generations were crumbling, brick by brick. What had begun as a spark in Redville was growing into something greater, a clarion call that echoed far beyond its borders, challenging the world to listen. Days later, the community center was alive with a restless energy, its chipped walls vibrating with the buzz of anticipation. Ethan stood at the front, his quiet strength anchoring the room as dozens of townsfolk packed the folding chairs and lined the back walls. Coal workers rubbed shoulders with shopkeepers. Teachers fidgeted beside skeptics who'd come only to scoff. Ethan's eyes swept over them all, taking in the tapestry of face some weary, some hopeful, all searching for something to believe in. When he spoke, his voice was a steady thread, weaving them together. Redville's at a crossroads. He began, his tone firm yet inviting, pulling them into the moment. For too long, we've been anchored to the past, holding tight to what's easy instead of reaching for what could be. That stops now. A murmur rippled through the crowd, agreement mingling with curiosity, doubt with tentative trust. He turned to a whiteboard behind him, its surface scrawled with a simple plan in bold strokes. "We're building a future on 3 pillars," he said, his hands sweeping across the words. "Education, infrastructure, and economic opportunity. These aren't just words, they're lifelines, not just to keep us afloat, but to help us thrive." He tapped the first point, education, his voice sharpened with resolve. "Our schools are falling apart. Classrooms are packed, teachers are stretched thin, and our kids are making do with scraps. That ends today. We're redirecting town funds to fix it: new books, more staff, better spaces. And it's not a pipe dream, it's a promise." A hand shot up from the crowd. Miss Carter, a teacher with tired eyes and a voice laced with doubt. "Ethan, we've heard this before," she said, hesitating as if the words pained her. "What makes this different? How do we know it's not just talk?" He met her gaze head on, unflinching. "Because we're doing it together," he replied. "We're setting up a fund, transparent, run by parents and teachers like you, every cent accounted for. And if that's not enough, I'll chase down state grants myself until it is." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through her guarded exterior. Ethan moved to the next point, infrastructure, his voice rising with a quiet urgency. "Our roads are a mess, our parks are forgotten, and half the time the lights flicker like they're about to give up. We deserve better than that. Next month, we start fixing it. Local crews, local jobs, pouring the benefits right back into Redville." From the back, Bill Hayes, a burly man with a permanent frown, crossed his arms tighter. "Sounds pretty," he said gruffly, "but money doesn't grow on trees. Where's it coming from?" Ethan didn't miss a beat. "The state's sitting on rural development funds we've never touched," he said, his tone clipped and certain. "I've already got donors lined up, 2 private folks who'll chip in if we show we're serious. It's on us to match them, and we will." Bill's scowl didn't fade, but he stayed quiet, the logic chipping away at his resistance. Finally, Ethan turned to economic opportunity, his eyes lingering on the coal workers scattered through the room. "Redville's leaned on one industry for too long," he said, his voice softening but firm. "The world's shifting, and we can't just dig our heels in and pretend it's not. This isn't about abandoning what we've got, it's about growing beyond it. Training programs for new trades, incentives for businesses to plant roots here, jobs that don't just keep us alive, but let us build something." Tommy piped up again, his voice bright with conviction. "What about the ones who don't want this? The ones who think everything's fine as is?" Ethan's expression didn't waver. "Change isn't easy, Tommy. Some'll fight it tooth and nail. But this isn't about forcing anyone, it's about opening doors for everyone, no matter where they stand." The room stilled, Ethan's vision hanging in the air like a challenge and a promise. Then, slowly, the applause began, a few hesitant claps swelling into a roar that shook the walls. It was more than agreement, it was a vow, a town claiming its future. Beyond the center's doors, Redville was no longer just a speck on the map, it was a lesson, a warning, a beacon. Justice, they were learning, wasn't handed down from on high. It was forged in the grit of their own hands. And the consequences of power misuse, leaders like Rick, who'd ruled through fear, were a shadow they'd no longer live under. The world was watching, and Redville was ready to lead. The whispers of Ethan Daniels' ambitious plan swept through Redville like a sudden gust of wind, stirring the quiet streets of the small town into a flurry of anticipation. It didn't take long for the local media to catch wind of the brewing excitement. Reporters descended upon the town, their cameras flashing and notepads scribbling, each one hungry to document the tale of a humble community, teetering on the edge of something extraordinary. Ethan's voice, steady and brimming with conviction, soon echoed far beyond the town's modest borders. His speech, delivered with a clarity that cut through the static of everyday life, was broadcast across the state, its words reverberating in the hearts of listeners who had never even set foot in Redville. "This isn't just about patching up what's broken," he told the swarm of reporters, his eyes alight with purpose. "It's about building something stronger, something lasting. It's about handing hope back to people not just here, but in every forgotten corner that's been dismissed and left to fade." His message struck a chord, and soon the story spilled onto the national stage. Headlines blazed across major outlets: "A governor's quest to revive rural America," and "Redville awakens, one town's defiant stand for change." Yet amid the growing spotlight, Ethan remained grounded, his focus unshaken. He rolled up his sleeves, meeting with state officials to hammer out grant applications, hosting workshops where townsfolk could pour out their ideas, and knocking on the doors of local businesses to spark investment. Not everyone was swept up in the fervor, though. Shadows of doubt lingered in the corners of Redville, particularly among those who clung to the town's old rhythms, wary of losing the control they'd held for so long. George Harper stood as the loudest voice of skepticism, a man whose furrowed brow and sharp tongue had long been fixtures in Redville. During a televised town hall, he leaned into the microphone, his words slicing through the room like a cold blade. "You make it all sound so easy, Ethan," he said, his voice taut with challenge. "But change isn't just about tossing money at cracked roads and leaky roofs. It's about shifting how people think, how they feel, and that's not something you can fix in a day." The crowd held its breath as Ethan met George's gaze, his expression calm but thoughtful, as if weighing every syllable. "You're not wrong, George," he replied, his tone measured yet firm. "Real change is a slow burn. It demands patience, grit, and belief in something bigger than what we see right now. But it starts with a choice to act, even when the odds feel stacked against us. That's what we're doing here, and I believe this town's ready to make it." The room erupted, applause crashing over George's doubts like a rising tide, drowning his skepticism in a wave of collective resolve. As Redville began to shift its streets buzzing with new energy, its story rippled outward, lighting a spark of inspiration for other struggling towns. Ethan's vision had grown beyond the dusty borders of his hometown. It was a testament that even the smallest places could send tremors of change far and wide. At the back of the community center, Rick Barnes stood alone, his arms crossed tightly against his chest as if shielding himself from the swell of voices around him. The room was packed, every chair filled with townspeople who had gathered to hash out Ethan's proposed changes. Rick had been to these meetings before, but back then, he'd strode in with the swagger of authority, his uniform a silent demand for attention. Now, he was different, quieter, humbler, a man trying to stitch together the trust he'd torn apart with months of unchecked pride. As Ethan called the meeting to order, his voice cutting through the hum of anticipation, Rick's eyes darted around the room. He caught the sit-along glances, the whispers that followed him like shadows. He couldn't fault them for it. He'd earned their wariness. When Ethan opened the floor for volunteers to tackle the town's first big project, repairing the crumbling stretch of Main Street, Rick felt a jolt of resolve. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the worn wooden floor. "I'll help," he said, his voice softer than the townsfolk were used to hearing. A hush fell over the crowd, every head swiveling to stare. Linda Collins, perched near the front with her arms folded, arched an eyebrow, her skepticism plain as day. "You're volunteering?" she asked, her tone laced with disbelief, as if testing whether this was some kind of ploy. Rick nodded, meeting her gaze. "Yeah," he said simply. "Someone's got to step up and show it can be done, right?" Ethan, standing tall at the podium, offered a small nod, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "It's a solid start," he said, then shifted to the next topic, leaving Rick's gesture to linger in the air. The following Saturday, Rick showed up at the work site, a far cry from the polished officer Redville once knew. Clad in faded jeans and a plain t-shirt, he looked more like one of the laborers than the man who'd once strutted through town. With a badge pinned to his chest, he grabbed a shovel and joined a cluster of volunteers. Jim Hayes, with his quiet strength, and Tommy, whose sharp eyes missed nothing. At first, the air between them crackled with tension. The others kept their distance, their words clipped and cautious whenever Rick drew near. He felt the weight of their mistrust pressing against him, but he didn't flinch. He dug into the gravel, patched the jagged cracks in the pavement, and kept his head down, letting his sweat speak where words failed. Tommy, curiosity finally getting the better of him, broke the uneasy silence. "Didn't think I'd see you out here," he said, his voice flat but tinged with a question. Rick paused, wiping the grime from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Figured it's time I stopped jawing and started moving," he replied, his tone earnest. Tommy studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod, a glimmer of respect flickering in his eyes. "Fair enough," he muttered. As the sun climbed higher, the frost between them began to thaw. By lunchtime, Rick found himself seated on a patch of grass with a handful of workers, swapping stories about Redville's rougher daystales of storms that tore through barns and winters, that tested the town's grit. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall that had stood between them. Over the weeks that followed, Rick's hands grew calloused, his presence a quiet constant at every meeting and work site. He stayed late to stack chairs or sweep floors, delivered paint cans and lumber for the school renovation, and lingered to hear teachers fret over outdated textbooks or parents vent about leaky ceilings. At first, his efforts were met with raised eyebrows and muttered doubts. George Harper, ever the cynic, cornered Linda one evening as they watched Rick haul boxes into the community center. "What's he playing at?" George grumbled, his voice low and suspicious. "All this just to polish his image." Linda, who'd been observing Rick's steady persistence, tilted her head thoughtfully. "Maybe he's just trying to be better, George," she said. "Isn't that what we've been asking for?" One night, during a tense discussion about the new vocational training program, Rick rose to his feet, the room falling silent as if bracing for a storm. "I've messed up plenty," he began, his voice steady but heavy with regret. "I let my ego run the show, thinking this badge made me untouchable. I disrespected good people who didn't deserve it, and I'm sorry. This town deserves more than that. You deserve more. I'm here to make it right, whatever it takes." For a heartbeat, the silence held, thick and uncertain. Then Linda stood, clapping softly, followed by Jim, then Tommy. Soon the room joined in at a roaring ovation, but a quiet, deliberate acknowledgement of a man laying his flaws bare. Rick's road wasn't smooth. Old instincts clawed at him, threatening to drag him back to the arrogance he'd once worn like armor. One afternoon, frustrations over the training program's delays boiled over, and he snapped at Tommy, his voice rising in a way that echoed his former self. The air stiffened, memories of his past bluster hanging between them. Tommy didn't flinch. "We're all in this, Rick," he said, his tone firm. "You're not the only one carrying the load." Rick's jaw clenched, a flicker of defensiveness flaring in his chest, but he caught himself. He exhaled, long and slow. "You're right," he admitted, stepping back. "Take the lead on this one." That moment shifted something in him. From then on, he listened more, controlled less, and let others steer when his impulses urged him to dominate. By the time Main Street stood reborn, its pavement smooth, its storefronts gleaming, Rick had clawed back a shred of the respect he'd squandered. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, he stood shoulder to shoulder with the crowd, clapping as Ethan spoke of resilience and unity. Afterward, Ethan approached him, his face unreadable but his voice warm. "You've come a long way, Rick," he said. Rick glanced down, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Still got a ways to go," he replied. Ethan nodded. "But you're heading the right way. That's what counts." Redville felt alive now, its pulse quickened by more than just new roads or freshly painted school walls. It was in the way people carried themselves, heads higher, voices softer, ears open. A town once choked by grudges and stale traditions now breathed with cautious hope. Ethan stood on the town hall steps one final time, gazing out at the sea of faces gathered below. His work here was nearly done, and though he wasn't one for grand goodbyes, the sight of Redville's rebirth stirred something deep within him. "This place isn't perfect," he said, his voice steady and clear. "No place is. But greatness doesn't come from being flawless, it comes from facing your cracks and choosing to mend them together. You've shown that's possible here, with respect, with purpose." The crowd roared, a swell of pride rippling through them. Ethan spotted Lyndon nodding firmly, Tommy beaming with quiet triumph, and even George clapping grudgingly, but they're all the same. As the noise faded, he stepped closer to the edge of the steps, his tone softening. "I'm leaving soon, but this isn't my story anymore. It's yours, your town, your future. What happens next is in your hands." The square lingered with life after he finished. Handshakes traded and conversations flowing freer than they once had. At the crowd's edge, Rick stood alone, watching it all unfold, a man still finding his place, but no longer an outsider in the town he'd helped reshape. The lesson woven through Redville's transformation stretched beyond its borders, a stark reminder of justice's quiet power and the ruin that follows when authority oversteps. Ethan's steady hand had guided the town toward renewal, but it was Rick's faltering, earnest climb from arrogance to accountability that laid bare a deeper truth. Power unchecked breeds division, while power humbled can mend it. Together, they turned Redville into a mirror for Thursa Small, stubborn proof that redemption and responsibility could rewrite even the most fractured stories. From a distance, Ethan watched as the dusty streets of Redville stretched out before him, the faint hum of life buzzing beneath the late afternoon sun. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached Rick, each step deliberate, his piercing gaze locked on the man ahead. Rick stood near the edge of the town square, his broad shoulders stiffening as he caught sight of Ethan drawing near. A ripple of emotions danced across Rick's weathered face, nervousness tightening his jaw, yet a flicker of eager anticipation softening his eyes. He shifted his weight, the dry earth kicking up faint clouds around his boots. As Ethan closed the distance between them, "You've traveled quite a journey to get here, Rick," Ethan said, his voice steady and warm, extending a calloused hand in greeting. Rick's eyes darted to the outstretched palm, a storm of hesitation swirling within him. For a heartbeat, he stood frozen, wrestling with the weight of the moment, pride clashing with humility bore. Finally grasping Ethan's hand, the grip was firm, almost desperate, as if Rick feared letting go might unravel the fragile thread of redemption he'd begun to weave. "I wouldn't have made it this far without that jolt you gave me," Rick confessed, his voice a low rumble, rough around the edges, but laced with an honesty that surprised even himself. He averted his gaze for a moment, staring at the cracked earth beneath his feet, the memory of his past arrogance gnawing at him. Ethan's expression softened, though his eyes held a quiet intensity. "It wasn't just a jolt, Rick. It was a crossroads. You chose the path, and you stayed on it. That's what counts." Their handshake lingered, a silent pact sealed in the press of skin and the unspoken understanding that passed between them. When their hands finally parted, the air seemed heavier, charged with a meaning too vast for words to hold. The stillness that followed was profound, a sacred pause that carried the echoes of reconciliation and the tentative promise of something better. Around them, the townsfolk had been watching from porches and shop windows began to stir. A soft clap broke the silence, tentative at first, like the patter of rain on a dry roof. Then another joined, and another, until the sound swelled into a wave of applause, rolling through the square with a force that spoke of approval, of hope rekindled. Rick's head turned slowly, his cheeks flushing a faint pink under the scrutiny. Yet, beneath the embarrassment, a faint smile tugged at his lips, a rare, unguarded expression as he dipped his head in quiet acknowledgement. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself in the small, cluttered living room of his Redville home, folding shirts and stacking books into a worn suitcase. The wooden floor creaked beneath his weight as he moved, the sound of familiar comfort in the stillness. Grace Daniels, his mother, stood framed in the doorway, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, Her silver-streaked hair caught the light filtering through the window, and her eye-sharp yet tender followed her son's every motion. "You've done something real good here, Ethan," she said, her voice thick with pride, though it wavered slightly with the ache of his impending departure. Ethan paused, his fingers resting on the suitcase zipper, and offered her a faint, weary smile. "It wasn't just me, Mom. It never is." Grace stepped closer, her hand finding his arm, her touch grounding him. "You showed them what they could build together. That's a gift most folks never get." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and Ethan felt them settle deep into his chest. He nodded, his throat tight. "Let's just hope they take it and run with it," he replied, zipping the suitcase shut with a final, resolute tug. As Ethan's car rumbled down Redville's main street for the last time, the town unfolded around him like a living tapestry of change. The engine growled softly, a steady companion to his thoughts, while his eyes caught glimpses of transformation in the periphery. Near the park at swings once rusted and still children shrieked with laughter, their small feet pounding the freshly laid gravel paths. Linda Collins, her auburn hair tied back in a practical knot, marched purposefully at the head of a group of volunteers, their arms laden with paint cans and tools, bound for the community center where the skeleton of a new project was already taking shape. Even George Harper, a grizzled man whose cynicism had long been his shield, was there, heaving crates of supplies from a truck alongside Tommy, the young man's weary frame moving with eager determination. Their banter floated through the open window, gruff but tinged with a warmth that hinted at bonds forged in shared purpose. Redville was far from perfect, its scars still visible in the peeling paint of old houses and the wary glances of some residents. But the roots of progress had begun to dig deep into its soil. Months later, the flicker of a television screen illuminated a dimly lit living room somewhere far from Redville. A news anchor's polished voice cut through the quiet, narrating a segment that cast the town as a beacon of renewal. Redville stands as a testament to what a community can achieve when its people choose resilience over resignation, the anchor declared, her tone bright with admiration. The footage rolled. Rick Barnes, once a towering figure of control whose word had been law, now bent over a trash bag, organizing a cleanup with a quiet focus that belied his former self. His hands moved with purpose, but his eyes carried a shadow of regret. A man acutely aware of the cost of his past misuse of power. Linda Collins appeared next, her voice rising with fervor as she spoke to the camera about unity, her hands gesturing wildly, her passion a flame that had ignited others. Tommy, barely 20, stood beside her, his shy grin breaking through as he described the vocational program that had given Hyman a thirst a lifeline to a future he'd once thought impossible. The camera lingered on the town square, where a modest plaque gleamed under the midday sun. Etched into its surface were the words, "Redville, a community built on respect and dignity." As the lens panned across the inscription, Ethan's voice seemed to whisper through the hearts of those who remembered him. A quiet refrain. Respect and dignity aren't just pretty words, they are the bedrock of everything worth having. Redville had become living proof that even the smallest, most overlooked places could ignite a fire of change, a lesson in justice that resonated far beyond its borders. The consequences of power wielded without care had nearly broken the town, but the choice to rebuild, to hold each other accountable, had stitched it back together stronger than before. Far from Redville's dusty streets, David Williams eased his old sedan into the parking lot of Crest Hill Academy, the prestigious school where he served as principal. The day had been a marathon, meetings that dragged on like endless sermons, parents airing grievances with the entitlement only wealth could breed, and staff squabbles that tested his patience. But now, as the engine sputtered to a stop, a flicker of relief warmed his chest. It was time to pick up Liam and Sophia, the bright spots in his world. Stepping out into the crisp evening air, he felt the familiar weight of eyes on him, subtle, fleeting glances from the other parents, their polished SUVs gleaming under the lot's floodlights. He was used to it by now, the way his presence unsettled them. A black man in a place like Crest Hill, with its manicured lawns and whispered legacies, was always an outsider, no matter that he held the keys to the school itself. But tonight, those glances sharpened into something uglier. Two police officers stood near the main gate, their postures rigid, their eyes tracking him like hawks. David knew Theme Officer Grant, with his perpetually furrowed brow, and Officer Murphy, whose smirk seemed etched into his face. Both white, both in their 40s. They relished the authority their badges granted them in this affluent bubble, where trouble was a rarity, but suspicion was a pastime. As David walked toward the entrance, his briefcase swinging lightly at his side, Grant's voice sliced through the air. "Sir, can we have a word?" David stopped, turning slowly, a knot of frustration already tightening in his gut. He knew this script well. "Yes, officer," he replied, his tone measured, a shield against the storm he sensed brewing. Grant's eyes raked over him, narrowing as if trying to peel back layers to find something incriminating. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice clipped. David straightened, meeting the officer's gaze. "I'm here to pick up my children." Murphy stepped closer, his hand resting lazily on his belt, too close to his holster for comfort. "Your children? At this school?" The disbelief in his tone was a blade, and David felt a twist. He forced a smile, one he'd perfected over years of navigating spaces that didn't want him. "Yes, Liam and Sophia Williams. They're students here." The officers exchanged a look, a silent conversation that excluded him. "Got any ID?" Grant pressed, his voice hardening, a challenge wrapped in routine. David's chest tightened as he noticed the growing cluster of parents nearby, their curious stares pressing against him like a physical weight. Some whispered behind manicured hands, others shifted uncomfortably, their discomfort a quiet betrayal. "Why do I need to show ID to pick up my own kids?" he asked, his calm fraying at the edges. Murphy leaned in, his breath sour with coffee. "Because we don't know you, and you don't exactly fit the picture around here." Their at-waist accusation, naked and unapologetic. David's pulse quickened, anger simmering beneath his skin, but he held it in check. "I'm not sure what you mean by that. I'm the principal of this school. I belong here more than most." Grant's laugh was sharp, a bark of mockery that stung like a slap. "The principal? That's rich. Let's see some ID. Principal." David's fingers twitched, torn between compliance and defiance. He could end this now, pull out his wallet, and walk away, but the humiliation of proving himself in a place he'd earned burned like acid in his throat. He glanced at the crowd again, their whispers a chorus of judgment, and felt the weight of their indifference. "Come on," Murphy added, his tone darkening. "Let's keep this simple. ID, or we do it the hard way." Grant edged closer, his voice dropping to a menacing hush. "Don't play games. We can do this quiet, or we can make it loud." David's heart hammered, but his face remained a mask of steel. They wanted a reaction, a spark to justify their power. Instead, he reached into his pocket with deliberate slowness, retrieving his wallet and sliding out his driver's license. Grant snatched it, holding it up to the light as if it might dissolve under scrutiny. "David Williams," he read, his head shaking slightly, as if the name itself defied logic. "And you're really the principal." David said nothing, his jaw locked tight, waiting. Murphy, meanwhile, sauntered over to David's sedan, peering through the windows with exaggerated suspicion. "This yours?" he called. "Yes," David replied, his voice taut. Murphy snorted. "This beat-up thing doesn't exactly scream private school principal, does it?" The words landed like a punch, and David felt the sting ripple through him. He glanced around again, parents turning away, their pity and disdain mingling in the air. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," Grant said, tossing the ID back with a flick of his wrist. "Someone matching your description." David's temper flared, and he stepped forward, locking eyes with Grant. "Suspicious activity? You mean a black man picking up his kids?" Grant's eyebrow arched, a flicker of amusement in his gaze. "No need to get hostile. We're just doing our job." David's fists clenched, his voice low and steady. "Your job is harassing a father who's done nothing wrong?" Before the officers could respond, a small, bright voice cut through the tension. "Daddy!" David turned, his heart lifting as Liam and Sophia raced toward him, their school bags bouncing against their backs. He dropped to his knees, scooping them into his arms, their warmth a balm against the coldness of the moment. They clung to him, chattering about their day, oblivious to the scene they'd interrupted. The officers stood frozen, their smugness fading as the reality of their mistake settled over them. David rose, his children at his side, and fixed the men with a steady gaze. "I don't need to prove anything to you," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. He turned away, guiding Liam and Sophia toward the car, their laughter a defiant echo against the silence of the officers' retreat. In both Redville and Crest Hill, the stories wove a common thread. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed from above, it was a choice, a fight, a reckoning. Rick's fall from power taught him the ruin that follows its abuse, while David's stand against prejudice carved a path for dignity to prevail. The consequences of wielding authority without care lingered like shadows, but the courage to confront it lit the way forward, proving that even in the smallest battles, the deepest truths could take root and flourish. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Crest Hill Academy, its golden rays doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep within David Williams' chest. He stood there, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes locking with those of the two officers one final time. Their gazes flickered with a mix of defiance and unease, but David didn't linger on it. As the principal of this prestigious school, he had made his decision. There would be no more words wasted on explanations or pleas. With a quiet resolve that masked the storm brewing inside him, he reached down and took the small, trusting hands of his children, Liam and Sophia, into his own. Without so much as a backward glance, he turned and led them away, his polished shoes clicking against the asphalt, each step a deliberate rejection of the humiliation that clung to him like a suffocating fog. The officers stood frozen, their radios crackling faintly in the background, their faces a tableau of stunned disbelief as this mantle, black and unbowed, walked past them with his head held high. David could feel the weight of their stares boring into his back, but he refused to let it break him. His heart thundered in his chest, a wild drumbeat of anger and shame. Yet he forced his breathing to remain steady, his expression calm. For Liam and Sophia, he had to be the rock they could lean on, the unshakable figure who shielded them from the ugliness of the world. The kids skipped along beside him, their voices bubbling with the carefree chatter of youth. Liam recounting a playground victory, Sophia giggling over a silly joke from lunch. They were blissfully oblivious to the scene that had just unfolded, their innocent eyes still untouched by the harsh realities David knew too well. He envied that purity, that ability to see the world as a place of wonder rather than a battlefield. But deep down, a quiet ache gnawed at him. He knew that innocence wouldn't last forever, and the thought of it slipping away filled him with a dread he couldn't shake. When they reached the car, David opened the back door with a gentleness that belied the tension coiling in his muscles. He helped Sophia buckle her seatbelt, her tiny fingers fumbling with the clasp, and then leaned over to secure Liam, who was still babbling about his day. The mundane act of fastening their seatbelts grounded him, a fleeting tether to normalcy amid the chaos swirling in his mind. But as he straightened up, a prickling sensation danced across the back of his neck. He turned slowly, and there she was, Sarah, his wife, standing just a few feet away. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her face a storm of emotions, worry etched into the furrow of her brow, anger flashing in her hazel eyes. The late afternoon breeze tugged at her hair, but she stood rooted to the spot, her presence both a comfort and a challenge. "I saw everything," she said, her voice low and taut, each word laced with a fury she was barely holding back. David shut the car door with a soft thud, the sound swallowed by the heavy silence that followed. He took a deep breath, the air sharp in his lungs, and walked toward her. "Yeah," he replied, his tone deceptively even, though beneath it simmered a frustration he couldn't fully conceal. "What did you see?" Sarah's gaze darted toward the officers still loitering near the school entrance, their heads bent together as if pretending not to watch this private moment unfold. "I saw them treating you like you didn't belong here," she said, her voice trembling with indignation, "like you were some stranger, not the man who runs this place." David nodded slowly, his jaw tightening until it ached, because in their eyes, "I don't belong here," he said, the words cutting through the air like a blade. "That's the problem, Sarah." Her face crumpled slightly, guilt washing over her features like a sudden tide. She dropped her eyes to the ground. her fingers twisting together nervously. "I should have stepped in," she murmured, almost to herself. "I should have said something, done something." David let out a long, weary sigh, rubbing the back of his neck where tension had knotted his muscles. "And what would you have said, Sarah?" he asked. His voice tinged with an edge sharper than he'd meant. "That your husband's the principal, that he's got every right to be here. They shouldn't need you to vouch for me." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know that," she whispered, her voice so soft it barely carried over the hum of distant traffic. "But I could have, I don't know. I just stood there." David's tone hardened, the bitterness spilling over despite his efforts to rein it in. "What, Sarah, you were afraid? Afraid that if you stepped in, you'd confirm every damn stereotype your parents have about us?" The words hit her like a slap, and she flinched, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment, the only sound was the muffled chatter of Liam and Sophia drifting from inside the car, their voices a stark contrast to the tension crackling between their parents. David regretted the harshness of his words almost instantly, but the raw sting of the encounter with the officers was still too fresh, too deep. Sarah turned her head away, struggling to find a response, her lips parting and closing as if the right words were just out of reach. "I didn't want them to think that," she finally said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want them to think you needed me to step in to be taken seriously." David's expression softened, the anger draining from him as he saw the pain in her eyes. He stepped closer, resting a hand on her arm, his touch gentle but firm. "I know you didn't," he said quietly, "but the truth is, it wouldn't have mattered. You stepping in wouldn't have changed what they already believe about me, about people who look like me." Sarah swallowed hard, blinking rapidly to keep the tears at bay. "I hate this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I hate that this keeps happening to you, to us." David nodded, his own pain mirroring hers, though it carried a different weight, a weight forged by years of navigating a world that too often saw him as a threat rather than a man. "So do I," he said simply. "But this is the reality we live in. And the hardest part, one day, it's going to happen to Liam and Sophia." The words hung between them like a dark prophecy, heavy and unyielding. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, to deny it, but no sound came. She knew he was right. Despite all the love they poured into their children, despite the walls they tried to build around them, the world beyond would judge them by their skin before their souls. "They can't keep getting away with this," Sarah said suddenly, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and helplessness. "You shouldn't have to go through this just to pick up our kids." David glanced over at the cluster of parents lingering nearby, their eyes darting toward him before quickly looking away. They'd seen it all, confrontation, the humiliation, but had done nothing. "No, I shouldn't," he agreed, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But it's not the first time, and it won't be the last. They didn't see me as a father or a principal, Sarah. They saw a black man, and that was enough for them." Sarah shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "So what do we do, David? How do we fight this?" He fell silent, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the sun was sinking lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. It was a question he'd wrestled with countless times. Do you push back against a system that deems you less than human? How do you challenge a world that refuses to see your worth, no matter how high you climb? "We do what we've always done," he said at last, his voice steady with a quiet determination. "We keep going. We keep showing our kids what it means to stand tall. We don't let them define who we are." Sarah nodded, brushing a tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. "You shouldn't have to do this alone, David," she said softly. "We're in this together." A faint smile tugged at his lips, a flicker of gratitude breaking through the weariness that had settled over him. "I know," he replied, his voice gentler now, "and I'm thankful for that. But this isn't something you can fix with words. I need to stand up for myself, for us, for our family, for everyone who's ever been made to feel like this." Sarah reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his with a fierce tenderness. "We'll figure it out together," she said, her grip tightening as if she could anchor him against the tide of injustice, threatening to pull him under. They stood there in the fading light, the unspoken bond between them a fragile lifeline amidst the chaos. But the sting of the day lingered, a bitter reminder that no matter how hard David worked earning degrees, leading a school, building a life that would always face a world demanding he prove his right to exist. The sound of approaching footsteps broke their reverie, and David turned to see Officer Grant striding toward them, his boots scuffing against the pavement. The man's face was a mask of forced politeness, his smile tight and insincere. "Sir, ma'am," he began, his tone stiff with formality. "I just wanted to apologize for earlier. We were just doing our job, but we realize now there was a misunderstanding." David's eyes narrowed, a cold fire sparking within him. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice low and measured, each syllable dripping with restrained fury. Grant shifted uncomfortably, nodding. "Yeah, we didn't realize you were the principal." "If we'd known," David cut him off, stepping closer, his presence commanding despite the exhaustion weighing him down. "If you'd known, you would have treated me differently," he said, his gaze piercing. Grant faltered, his confidence crumbling under the intensity of David's stare. "Well, yes, probably," he admitted, his voice faltering. David's lips pressed into a thin line, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "And that's the problem," he said, his words deliberate and unflinching. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect." Grant swallowed hard, clearly unprepared for the confrontation, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "We're just trying to keep the community safe," he mumbled, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. David's eyes never wavered, his voice steady as steel. "Then start by treating the people in this community like they belong here." Without waiting for a reply, he turned back to Sarah, his shoulders tense but resolute, and walked to the car. The air around them seemed to thrum with the aftershock of his words, the bitter taste of the day lingering like smoke. The next morning, as David drove back to Crest Hill Academy, the weight of the previous day pressed down on him like a physical burden. The school had always been his sanctuary, a place where his title and accomplishments carried meaning, where he was David Williams, principal, not just another man to be questioned or dismissed. But now, even that refuge felt tainted, the echoes of yesterday's humiliation seeping into the brick walls and polished floors he'd once taken pride in. The parking lot was already alive with activity when he arrived, parents milling about in tight-knit groups, their heads bowed over glowing phone screens. Whispers followed him as he stepped out of the car, a low buzz that prickled at his senses. He'd learned long ago to tune out the background noise of judgment, but today it was sharper, more insistent, cutting through the armor he'd built over years of resilience. Inside, the administrative wing was a hive of quiet tension. Amanda, his secretary, greeted him at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Williams," she said, her voice tinged with unease. David nodded, his gaze flicking over her face, catching the worry she couldn't quite hide. "Morning, Amanda," he replied, his tone clipped but polite. "Everything okay?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the phone in her hand, then held it out to him. "I thought you should see this," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. David's stomach sank as he took the device, his eyes falling on the screen. There it was, a shaky video of the confrontation, now splashed across social media for all to see. The officer's stern faces, the crowd of onlookers, his children rushing to his sittite was all captured in grainy detail. Every moment of his humiliation laid bare. The caption screamed in bold letters, "Black principal harassed by police outside elite private school." Below it, thousands of comments spiraled into a chaotic mix of outrage, support, and cold indifference. David handed the phone back to Amanda, his hand trembling slightly despite his efforts to steady it. "Where did this come from?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Some parent must have filmed it," Amanda replied, her eyes soft with sympathy. "It's spreading fast. I didn't want to show you, but I thought you should know before the board sees it." The board. Of course, David's breath caught, his mind racing to the inevitable fallout. He could picture their faces now, stern, detached, more concerned with the school's pristine image than the injustice he'd endured. Before he could process the thought, a sharp knock sounded at his office door. He looked up to see Dean Matthews, the head of the school board, standing in the threshold. The man's expression was a blank slate, but the tightness in his posture betrayed his unease. "David," Matthews said, his voice clipped and professional, Can we talk? David forced a nod, his throat dry. Of course. Comin', he said, stepping aside as Matthews entered, the door clicking shut behind him. The room seemed to shrink with the weight of what was coming, and David braced himself for the conversation ahead, knowing that the fight for justice and the consequences of power misused would follow him even here, into the heart of the world he'd built. The door clicked shut with a soft thud as Matthew stepped into the office, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the thick carpet. He crossed the room with measured steps, the faint rustle of his suit jacket cutting through the heavy stillness. Settling into the chair across from David, he rested his hands on the desk, fingers interlocking deliberately as if to steady himself for what was coming. The wood gleamed under the dim light filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows that stretched across the room like unspoken accusations. For a prolonged moment, neither man spoke. The silence hung thick, a tangible weight pressing down on them both, laden with the tension of a storm about to break. Matthew's eyes flickered briefly to the desk, then back up to meet David's steady gaze. When he finally broke the quiet, his voice was low, tinged with a weariness he couldn't quite mask. I assume you've seen the video, David. David leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking faintly under his weight. His nod was slow, deliberate, his face a mask of calm that belied the fire simmering beneath. Yeah, I've seen it. His words were clipped, heavy with the exhaustion of a man who'd replayed the moment too many times in his mind. The grainy footage of flashing lights, raised voices, and the cold grip of handcuffs tightening around his wrists in front of his own children. Matthew let out a sigh, a long, drawn-out breath that seemed to carry the weight of his discomfort. He glanced down again, his fingers tightening slightly against each other before he lifted his eyes to David once more. This is unfortunate. We're getting calls non-stop. Parents are upset, and the board they are worried. They're afraid of what this says about the school, how it reflects on us. David's jaw clenched, a subtle shift that betrayed the storm brewing inside him. He tilted his head slightly, repeating Matthew's words with a dangerous calm that made the air feel sharper. The image this portrays of the school, his voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a quiet fury that sliced through the room like a blade. Matthew shifted in his seat, the chair squeaking faintly under his restless movement. He raised a hand, palm out, as if trying to deflect the tension radiating from David. Look, I get it. What happened was wrong, no one's denying that. But this thing's blown up. It's everywhere now. And some of the parents, they're rattled. They don't want their kids caught up in this kind of mess, this controversy. The words landed like a spark on dry tinder. David felt a surge of anger flare in his chest, hot and unrelenting, rising up his throat until he could taste it. He leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he fought to keep his voice level. So let me get this straight, Matthew. You're not worried that I was harassed Hewlett the police in broad daylight, right in front of my own kids and our students? No. Your big concern is how it might look to a bunch of wealthy parents who don't even know what it's like to live this. His eyes burned into Matthew's, unyielding, daring him to dodge the truth. Matthew's hands shot up again, more defensive this time, his fingers splaying wide as if to shield himself from the accusation. David, you know how it works. We're in a world where perception is everything. The school's got a reputation to protect. This kind of spotlight, it could damage us, scare people off. His tone was pleading now, tinged with a desperation he couldn't quite hide. But David just stared at him, disbelief coursing through every fiber of his being, a bitter tide that threatened to drown the last shred of patience he had left. Damage us, he echoed, his voice trembling with the weight of his outrage. I was publicly shamed. Matthew, dragged out like a criminal because of the color of my skin. And you're sitting here sweating over bad press? Matthew's shoulders slumped, another frustrated sigh escaping him as he rubbed a hand across his forehead. It's not just the press, David. It's about keeping the parents calm, keeping them invested. We can't afford to lose their trust. David shook his head slowly, the motion heavy with resignation. The conversation settled over him like a suffocating blanket, its threads woven with the same tired excuses he'd heard his whole life. What do you want me to do, then? He asked, his voice flat, hollowed out by the absurdity of it all. Pretend it didn't happen. act like everything's fine." Matthew hesitated, his lips parting as if the words were stuck somewhere deep inside him. He shifted again, the chair groaning under his unease. Maybe you could put out a statement." He ventured carefully, something to ease their minds. "Tell them the situation's handled, that the police were just doing what they're paid to do." David's head snapped up, his voice cutting through the air like a whip, low and laced with barely restrained fury. "Their jobs, you're saying their jobs involve targeting me, harassing me, because they couldn't believe a black man could belong here. That's what you call their job?" The room fell deathly still. Matthew froze, caught off guard by the raw intensity in David's tone. His mouth opened, then closed, words failing him as the weight of David's anger filled the space between them. For a long, agonizing moment, neither spoke. The silence was electric, crackling with everything left unsaid, years of frustration, of swallowed pride, of battles fought in quiet corners just to prove he deserved to be here. Finally, David leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, his eyes locking onto Matthew's with a resolve that felt like steel hardening in his spine. "I'm not letting this get buried," he said, his voice calm now but unyielding, each word a brick laid in a wall of defiance. "This isn't just about me. It's about every person of color who's ever walked through these doors and felt like they had to shrink themselves to fit. I won't put out some fluffy statement to excuse what happened. I won't." Matthew's expression tightened, unease flickering across his face, but he managed a slow nod. "I hear you, David. I do. Just be ready for what comes next. The fallout, it's not going to be easy." David straightened in his chair, a new strength settling into his bones. "I've been ready for this my whole life," he replied, his voice steady as granite. Matthew rose to his feet, his movements stiff, the discomfort of the exchange clinging to him like damp cloth. "We'll talk again soon. The board's going to want your input." He lingered for a moment, as if hoping for a softer resolution, but David only nodded, his mind already spinning with the storm on the horizon. As Matthew slipped out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him, David sat motionless, a whirlwind of emotions churning inside him. Anger pulsed through his veins, sharp and familiar. But there was something else, to a flicker of purpose, bright and fierce, cutting through the fog of frustration. This was his fight now, his chance to turn a moment of shame into a rallying cry. He wouldn't let it slip away. His gaze drifted to the desk, the polished surface reflecting the faint glow of the overhead light. The weight of the world seemed to press down on him, a burden he'd carried in silence for too long. The board might want to hush this up, smooth it over with platitudes and PR spin. But David knew better. Silence was complicity, and he was done playing along. He swiveled his chair toward the computer, the screen flickering to life as he opened a blank document. His hand hovered over the keyboard, fingers trembling slightly in it with fear, but with the sheer force of the words clawing their way out of him. This wouldn't be a pacifying memo to appease nervous parents. No, this would be a torch, a call to arms, a demand for justice that couldn't be ignored. The cursor blinked relentlessly, a tiny heartbeat against the white void of the screen. David stared at it, his mind racing. He had the platform, the voice, the power to shift the narrative. At the responsibility crushed him too. As a father, he saw his children's tear-streaked faces in that video, their confusion and fear etched into his memory. As a husband, he felt the weight of Sarah's worry, her unspoken question echoing in his ears. As the principal of this school, he bore the expectations of an institution that now seemed more obsessed with its pristine image than the people it served. Justice had been a distant dream for so long, but now it was a fire in his chest, and he couldn't snuff it out. His phone buzzed sharply on the desk, jolting him from his thoughts. The screen lit up with Sarah's name, her message short but piercing. "Have you seen the video?" David's thumb hovered over the keys, his heart tightening. "Yes," he typed back after a beat. "It's everywhere." Her reply came almost instantly. "What are you going to do?" He stared at the words, the question sinking into him like a stone. What was he going to do? The board wanted this swept away. A tidy little scandal they could bury with a bow on top. But staying quiet would only tighten the chains of the same old cycle. Power abused, voices silenced, justice denied. He couldn't let that happen. "I'm working on it," he texted back, setting the phone down with a soft clack. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the murmur of voices beyond his office door wash over him. Parents were gathering out there for a PTA meeting, oblivious to the fault lines cracking open beneath their feet. Part of him itched to storm out and face them, to lay bare the raw truth of what had happened. But he knew it'd be a powder keg today. A sharp knock broke his reverie. The door creaked open, and Amanda, his secretary, poked her head in, her round face framed by a halo of dark curls. "Mr. Williams," she said softly, her voice tinged with a warmth that felt like a lifeline. "The board's asking for you in the conference room." David's stomach dropped, a cold knot forming in his gut. Of course they wouldn't give him time to breathe, to strategize. They wanted him now, on their terms, with answers they could shape. He nodded, forcing a tight smile. "I'll be there in a minute." Amanda lingered, her eyes searching his face with a quiet empathy that caught him off guard. "David," she said, lowering her voice, "you don't have to face them alone. A lot of us here, we've got your back. We saw what happened. We know." Her words were a small buoy in the churning sea of his thoughts, but they couldn't lift the pressure bearing down on him. "Thanks, Amanda," he murmured, his voice rough with gratitude. "But this is something I've got to do myself." She offered a faint, encouraging smile before slipping back out, the door easing shut behind her. David stood, smoothing his tie with hands that felt too heavy, each breath a conscious effort to steel himself. The walk to the conference room was a slow march, every step reverberating through the polished halls like a drumbeat. The school's weight rested on his shoulders, its history, its students, its unspoken rules, and he carried it all as he pushed open the heavy door. The air inside was thick with tension, the long table stretching out like a battlefield. Matthew sat at the head, his posture stiff, flanked by board members whose faces were tight masks of concern, not for him, David knew, but for their precious reputation. Their eyes, sharp and appraising, tracked him as he took a seat at the far end, meeting each gaze with a quiet defiance that belied the chaos roiling inside him. Matthew cleared his throat, his tone carefully neutral, a diplomat navigating a minefield. "David, we appreciate you coming on short notice. As you can imagine, there's been a lot of talk since that video hit." David nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. He could feel where this was headed, the familiar script of damage control unfolding before him. "It's escalated fast," a woman to Matthew's left piped up, her voice clipped with urgency. She leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping lightly on the table. "Parents are calling, freaking out about the attention this is drawing. They're worried about their kids, about how this looks for the school." Her eyes darted to the others, seeking agreement, but David stayed silent, his stare unwavering. It was always about the optics, never the human cost, never the fact that his children had watched their father be reduced to a suspect in their own schoolyard. "We've talked it over," Matthew continued, his hands folding again in that deliberate way, as if to anchor himself, "and we think the best move is for you to put out a statement. Something clear, say the situation's under control, thank the police for their service, assure everyone we're keeping things positive here." The words twisted in David's gut like a knife, each syllable a betrayal of the truth he'd lived. He drew a slow breath, letting the silence stretch until it was taut, then spoke, his voice firm and unshaken. "I can't do that." Matthew blinked, startled, his composure faltering. "Excuse me, I can't." David repeated, leaning forward now, his hands flat on the table. "What happened wasn't a mix-up. It was racism, plain as day. I'm not going to dress it up in a lie just to make people feel better." The room went still, the air heavy with unease. Matthew coughed, scrambling to regain control. "David, we get that this was tough for you. We do. But you've got to see it from our side of this is about the whole school. We can't risk losing the community over this." David's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a low, resonant timbre that filled the space. "And what about the black families in this community, Matthew? What do I tell them if I let this slide? What do I tell the kids of color here, the ones who look to me, if I act like this doesn't matter? That their lives only count if the white parents stay happy?" The question hung there, a challenge no one dared answer. The woman shifted uncomfortably, her fingers stilling on the table. while another board member, a weary man with thinning hair, glanced away, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. Justice wasn't just a word to David, it was a reckoning, a mirror held up to the powerful who'd abused their authority and expected the world to look the other way. The police had flexed their might, the board was flexing theirs now, and both thought he'd bend. But he wouldn't, not this time. The consequences of their power games had scarred his family, his students, his soul, and he'd be damned if he let them write the ending. The room stayed silent, the tension a living thing, coiling tighter with every second. David held their gazes, unyielding. A man who'd found his line in the sand and refused to step back. This wasn't just his fight anymore, it was a lesson, a warning. That power unchecked would always reap a bitter harvest, and he'd make sure they all felt the weight of it. The air in the meeting room hung heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on, as Patricia, a woman in her early 50s with silver streaks threading through her dark hair, shifted uneasily in her seat. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, betraying the discomfort gnawing at her insides. "David, no one's saying your experience doesn't matter, believe me. We hear ya, but we're trying to shield the school. The kind of spotlight this could bring, it might leave scars that don't fade." Her eyes darted to the polished table, avoiding his gaze, as if the weight of her own words pressed her down. David sat across from her, his broad shoulders rigid, his hands clenched into fists on his lap. Frustration simmered beneath his calm exterior, bubbling up like a storm threatening to break. He shook his head slowly, the motion deliberate, as if shaking off the absurdity of her plea. "The only long-term effect I'm worried about," he said, his voice low but edged with steel, "is what we're teaching our kids. They need to know the truth, that racism isn't some distant myth. It's real, it's here, and they'll have to face it someday. We can't bury our heads in the sand, not in this school, not anywhere." His chest tightened as he spoke, each word a release of the anger and helplessness that had been building inside him. Since the incident, Patricia's lips parted, but no sound came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her discomfort morphing into something deeper, guilt, perhaps, or the flicker of recognition that he might be right. She sank back into her chair, her silence louder than any rebuttal. Beside her, Matthews, the board's de facto leader, leaned back with a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the world. His gray suit wrinkled as he slouched, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. "David," he said, his tone measured but laced with warning, "we respect where you're coming from, truly. But we've got to think bigger picture here strategically. If you're not willing to play ball, the board might have no choice but to reconsider your place here." His words hung in the air like a guillotine blade, poised to drop. David's heart lurched, a sharp, cold jolt slicing through him. He'd sensed this threat lurking in the shadows of their polite exchanges, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real, tangible, menacing. They were ready to toss him aside, a sacrificial lamb to preserve the pristine image of Crest Hill Academy. His jaw tightened, and he straightened in his chair, the wooden frame creaking under the shift of his weight. The pressure of their expectations bore down on him, but it only steeled his resolve. "If that's how it's going to be," he said, his voice quiet yet unyielding, "then go ahead and make your call. But I won't bend on what I believe, and I won't lie about what I went through, not for you, not for anyone." His eyes burned with a fierce determination, a man standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to leap rather than retreat. Matthew's face darkened, his brows knitting together in a scowl. He opened his mouth to fire back, but before a single word could escape, the door swung open with a sharp creak. Sarah stormed in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like the ticking of a clock counting down to reckoning. Her face was a mask of resolve, her chin lifted high, her eyes blazing with a fire that could scorch the room to ashes. "David's not going anywhere," she declared, her voice steady as granite, cutting through the stifling tension like a blade. "And if this board can't stand behind him, I'll make damn sure the whole community knows exactly why." David's head snapped toward her, his breath catching in his throat. Shock mingled with gratitude as he watched her stride forward, her presence a lifeline he hadn't known he needed until that moment. She planted herself beside him, a pillar of defiance, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The board members exchanged furtive glances, their composure cracking like thin ice under her glare. Matthews shifted uncomfortably, his chair groaning as he tried to reclaim authority. "Mrs. Williams." This as he began, but Sarah cut him off, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "I know exactly what this is," she snapped, stepping closer to the table, her shadow falling across its surface. "And I won't let you bully my husband into compromising who he is, just to polish your precious reputation." Her words were a thunderclap, reverberating through the room, and David felt a surge of awe as she seized control. She wasn't just his wife in that moment, she was a force of nature, her strength radiating outward, electrifying the air. He realized then how much power she carried, a quiet ferocity that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to unleash. The board sat in stunned silence, their unease palpable. Patricia's hands fidgeted in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she wrestled with the truth staring her in the face. Richard, a weary man with a perpetual frown, adjusted his glasses nervously, his foot tapping a restless rhythm under the table. For a fleeting second, time seemed to freeze, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on every soul in the room. David glanced at Sarah, his heart swelling with pride. She wasn't just defending him, she was fighting for their family, their values, and the future they dreamed of for their children, Liam and Sophia. Her courage bolstered his own, and together, they felt unbreakable. Matthews cleared his throat, the sound rough and grating, as he tried to claw back control. "Mrs. Williams, we hear your concerns, but—" "No," Sarah interrupted, her tone icy and unyielding. "You don't hear us. You think this is about David's job, about some mess you can sweep under the rug with a press release. But this is bigger than that. It's about dignity, about justice. What happened yesterday wasn't just an incident, it was a wake-up call. And if you can't see that, you've got no right sitting at this table, deciding the fate of this school." Her words landed like blows, stripping away the board's carefully constructed veneer of civility. The room tilted, the power shifting beneath their feet. David felt his tide turning, the polite masks slipping to reveal the raw truth they'd all been dodging. Richard squirmed in his seat, his voice tentative as he spoke up. "Look, we're not trying to brush this aside. We need to tread carefully. The school's reputation." "The school's reputation," David interjected, his voice calm but resolute, "is built on respect, inclusion, and education. If we bury this, what are we telling our students? That we ignore injustice when it's messy? That we stay silent because speaking up might ruffle feathers? That's not the lesson I want my kids or any kid to learn." His gaze swept the room, locking eyes with each board member, daring them to argue. Patricia met his stare, her expression softening as something clicked inside her. She leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now, thoughtful. "So what do you suggest we do?" "David." He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs like a lifeline. This was his chance not just to defend himself, but to spark real change. "We face it head on," he said, his words steady and sure. "We bring the whole school community into this, students, parents, staff, and we talk about it. Not to point fingers, but to understand. We need to address racism, bias, the things we pretend don't touch a place like Crest Hill. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear, it just leaves our kids defenseless when they do show up." Patricia nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the edge of the table as she mulled his words. Matthews, though, remained a wall of resistance, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed. "David, I get your passion really. We've got to think about the fallout. Not every parent will want this conversation. We could lose donors, see enrollment dip." His voice trailed off, but the warning lingered. David leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his gaze piercing Matthew's defenses. "If we're scared of losing support because we're doing what's right, then those aren't the people we want here. This is a chance to show our students what leadership really is, standing firm when it's tough, not just when it's convenient." His voice rang with conviction, a quiet power that filled the silence that followed. The room stilled again, but this time, the air felt charged with possibility. Glances flickered between the board members, some uncertain, others nodding faintly. Even Matthews seemed to waver, his fingers pressing against his temples as if wrestling with the inevitable. After a long, heavy pause, Patricia spoke again, her tone decisive. I'm with David. We can't dodge this. We need to face it, openly and honestly. Richard adjusted his glasses again, his frown easing as he chimed in. She's right. We've got to do something. One by one, the others began to agree, their voices tentative but growing steadier. Matthews scanned the room, realizing the tide had turned against him. He let out a defeated sigh, rubbing his face with both hands. Fine, he muttered. We'll go public with it. But we've got to be smart about how we spin it. David nodded, a small victory igniting a spark of hope within him. We'll frame it as a chance to unite, not divide. I'll work with the faculty, put together a plan that brings everyone in, students, parents, staff. This isn't just about reacting, it's about teaching. Sarah's hand found his arm, her touch a silent anchor. He felt the momentum building, a ripple that could grow into a wave. The following week, the auditorium buzzed with nervous energy. Rows of chairs stretched across the vast space, filled with students whispering to each other, parents exchanging wary glances, and teachers standing along the walls, arms crossed or hands clasped. The high ceiling loomed overhead, its exposed beams casting long shadows in the late afternoon light filtering through tall windows. David stood at the podium, his palms damp against the wood, his heart thudding in his chest. The video of his run-in with the police had spread like wildfire. Some called it outrageous. Others are rallying, crying now. The board had handed him the mic to address it his way. He took a deep breath, the sound amplified by the microphone, and looked out at the sea of faces. Some he knew well, students he'd taught, parents he'd chatted with at games. Others stared back with skepticism, their arms folded tight. Good morning, he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. I want to start by talking about what a lot of you have already seen. Our hard incident with the police last week. It was rough, not just for me, but for my family. And I know it stirred up a lot of questions for you too. The room fell silent, the tension so thick he could feel it pressing against his skin. He pressed on, his eyes finding Sarah in the front row, Liam and Sophia beside her. Their small faces turned up to him with trust that made his chest ache. What happened to me isn't a one-off. It's part of something bigger: racism, bias, injustice. It's hard to talk about, I get that. But we have to. The school's about more than test scores. It's about respect, empathy, fairness. We can't teach those things if we shy away from the hard stuff. What happened to me? It's proof this isn't someone else's problem, it's ours, right here in Crest Hill. He paused, letting the words settle, watching as heads tilted, eyes softened. I'm not saying this to guilt anyone, he continued, or to make you squirm. I'm saying it because we've got a shot here to learn, to grow, to be better. Our kids deserve that. They need to see us step up when things get tough, not just look the other way. Nods rippled through the crowd, slow at first, then stronger. Students leaned forward, their curiosity piqued. Parents unfolded their arms, some whispering to neighbors. So, David said, his voice lifting, we're starting something new at Crest Hill Academy. An initiative, workshops, talks, events about race, bias, inclusion, not just for the kids, but for all of us. Together, we can make this place more than a school, can make it a community where everyone's seen, heard, valued. The applause started as a murmur, a few hesitant claps, then swelled into a roar that echoed off the walls. David exhaled, relief washing over him, but beneath it burned a fire. Thighs wasn't the end, but the start. As the crowd dispersed, Sarah approached, her smile soft but radiant. You did it, she whispered, her hand slipping into his. He pulled her close, his arm around her shoulders, and looked down at Liam and Sophia, their eyes wide with awe. We did it, he corrected, his voice thick with emotion. They'd seen the world's ugliness, but today they'd glimpsed its hope too, and that, David knew, was where justice took root, not in silence, but in the courage to speak, to stand, to fight. The lesson was clear. Power misused could silence one voice, but united, those voices could shake the earth.